Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I just turned 32 when I moved into that apartment on Cedar Avenue last September. It was a decent place in a 4-story building from the 60s. Nothing fancy, but the rent was reasonable, and it had these original hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places. I was working as a graphic designer for a startup downtown, pulling long hours but finally making enough to live alone after years of roommates. The divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier, and I needed a fresh start somewhere nobody knew my story. I remember thinking how perfect the timing was when I found the listing online. Available immediately, 2nd floor, corner unit with lots of natural light. The landlord, Mr. Garrett, was this heavy-set guy with a permanent sunburn who kept talking about how quiet the building was, how everyone kept to themselves. The first few weeks were exactly what I needed. I'd wake up early, make coffee in my tiny kitchen with the yellow walls, and sit by the window watching people head to work. My cat, Whiskers, loved the wide windowsills and spent most of his time sprawled out in the sunshine. I met a few neighbors in passing, mostly just polite nods in the hallway. There was an elderly couple on the 3rd floor who always smelled like menthol cigarettes, a young guy on the 1st floor who played his music too loud on weekends, and next door to me lived this man named Gordon. He was probably mid-40s, always wore the same faded blue maintenance uniform even on weekends, had this thick beard that never seemed properly groomed. The first time we met, he was standing in the hallway when I was moving boxes in, just watching. He introduced himself, shook my hand for way too long, and kept asking if I needed help even after I'd said no 3 times. Around mid-October, little things started happening. First, it was my favorite coffee mug, the one with the cartoon avocado that my sister gave me. I always left it on the counter after washing it, but one morning it was in the cabinet with the plates. Then my phone charger disappeared from where I always plugged it in by the couch, only to show up days later in the bathroom drawer. I blamed myself, figured I was just stressed from the new project at work, moving things around without thinking. But then Whiskers started acting strange. He'd sit in the kitchen for hours, staring at the cabinets under the sink, sometimes pawing at them or making these low growling sounds I'd never heard from him before. I actually took him to the vet, thinking maybe he was sick, but they said he was perfectly healthy. The door situation started the last week of October. I've always been paranoid about locking up, a habit from living in sketchy neighborhoods during college. I'd check the deadbolt twice before bed, sometimes even getting up to check a 3rd time, but I started waking up to find the chain undone. Just the chain, never the deadbolt. The first time, I convinced myself I'd forgotten. The second time, I thought maybe the chain was loose and sliding open somehow. I even asked Mr. Garrett to look at it, and he tightened the screws, said it was solid, but it kept happening. I'd also noticed subtle things, like my shoes being slightly out of line by the door, or the living room blinds adjusted to a different angle. I started taking photos before bed, comparing them in the morning, and sure enough, things were moving. I ran into Gordon more frequently after that, always in the hallway when I was coming home from work. He'd be there checking his mail at 6:30, even though mail came at noon. Or he'd be fixing something in the hallway, a light bulb that worked fine, a doormat that wasn't even his. He started commenting on specific things about my routine, like how I must really love that Thai place on Fordham Road, since I ordered from there every Friday, or asking if my sister enjoyed her visit the previous weekend. Things he could only know if he'd been watching my comings and goings, seeing my takeout bags, listening through the walls. When I mentioned I was thinking about getting a security camera, his whole demeanor shifted. His face got red, and he went on this weird rant about privacy, how cameras made people paranoid, how the building was safe, and we all needed to trust each other. The breaking point came on a Monday night in early November. I'd been at a work presentation until almost 10, completely exhausted, just wanting to shower and crash. When I walked into my apartment, something was immediately wrong. The air felt different, like someone else's presence was still lingering. My laptop was open on the coffee table, which was impossible because I specifically remembered closing it that morning. There were crumbs on my kitchen counter, and I hadn't eaten there in days. But the worst part was the smell, this mixture of stale cigarettes and some kind of musky cologne that definitely wasn't mine. It was strongest in my bedroom. My jewelry box had been moved just an inch to the left, and my underwear drawer wasn't fully closed. I stood there in my own bedroom feeling violated in a way I couldn't even fully articulate. That's when I heard it, a soft thump from somewhere inside my apartment, like someone accidentally bumping into furniture. I grabbed my phone and a knife from the kitchen, then methodically checked every room, every closet, behind every door. Nothing. Nobody. But I knew someone had been there. Maybe still was there somehow. I called 911, my voice shaking as I explained everything to the dispatcher. 2 officers showed up within 15 minutes. A younger woman named Officer Daniels and her partner. An older guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They walked through the apartment, checking windows, testing the locks. The older cop kept giving me these looks like I was wasting their time, asking if I'd been drinking, if I was on any medication. But Officer Daniels took me seriously. She noticed that Whiskers was hiding under the bed, which she said was unusual for a cat when their owner was home. She stood in my kitchen for a long time, running her hands along the cabinets, checking the walls. That's when she found it. Behind the cabinet under my sink, the back panel was loose. Not just loose, it had been carefully modified with hinges so small you'd never notice unless you were really searching. When she pulled it open, we could see straight through into Gordon's apartment. He'd cut through the drywall between our units, creating a passage just large enough for someone to crawl through. The edges were smooth, sanded down, like he'd taken his time making sure it wouldn't snag on clothing. Officer Daniels called for backup immediately. Within minutes, my apartment was full of police, forensics people taking photos, detectives asking me questions. They found Gordon trying to leave through the building's back exit with a duffel bag. Inside it were some of my missing items, including that avocado mug, plus things I hadn't even realized were gone like a hairbrush, several photographs from my photo albums, and a spare key to my apartment that I kept hidden in a kitchen drawer. The detective who interviewed me, Detective Bryant, told me Gordon had been doing this for at least 2 months, probably since the week I moved in. He'd known the previous tenant, helped him move out, and that's when he'd started working on the passage. The maintenance uniform wasn't real. Gordon didn't work for the building or any company. He'd been unemployed for over a year, living off disability checks, spending his days in his apartment and, apparently, mine. They found notebooks in his place with detailed logs of my schedule, what I wore each day, phone conversations he'd overheard, even notes about my menstrual cycle based on products in my bathroom trash. He had a whole drawer full of plastic bags with items he'd taken, each one labeled with the date. There were things from other women too, former tenants from over the years, though I was the only one he'd built a passage for. What really got me was the photos they found on his computer. Hundreds of them, all taken inside my apartment while I was at work or asleep. Pictures of me sleeping, my mouth slightly open, hair spread across the pillow. Pictures of my clothes laid out on the bed like I was still wearing them. There was even video from a small camera he'd hidden in my shower drain, which explained why the water had been draining slowly. The forensics team said he'd been incredibly careful about when he entered, usually during my regular work hours, but sometimes he'd gotten bolder. Those nights when I'd woken up feeling watched, that instinct had been right. He'd been there, probably standing in my bedroom doorway, just watching me sleep. They found his fingerprints on my bed frame, my bathroom mirror, inside my closet. He'd touched everything, been everywhere, made himself at home in my private space. Gordon pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including burglary, stalking, and invasion of privacy. He got 8 years in prison, eligible for parole in 5. The prosecutor said it could have been worse if he'd touched me physically, but somehow that distinction didn't make me feel any better. Mr. Garrett had to pay for the wall repairs and gave me 3 months free rent, probably just to avoid a lawsuit. I stayed there exactly 1 more week while I looked for a new place, sleeping on a friend's couch because I couldn't stand being in that apartment at night. Every sound from the walls made me panic. Every creak of the floorboards sent me into a spiral. I'd catch myself checking behind the kitchen cabinets in the middle of the night, running my hands along the walls, searching for seams that shouldn't be there. Even Whiskers was different, jumpy and aggressive, hissing at shadows. I live in a different state now. A 5th-floor apartment with no shared walls except the floor and ceiling. I installed my own security system the day I moved in, cameras in every room that upload to the cloud, motion sensors, the works. My friends think I'm paranoid, but they didn't see those photos, didn't read those notebooks where someone had documented every detail of their life like they were a science experiment. Sometimes I still wake up at night and lie perfectly still, listening for sounds that don't belong, wondering if someone's watching. The detective told me Gordon had been a model prisoner so far, keeping to himself, no incidents. She also told me they'd found similar modifications in 2 other buildings where he'd lived before, though those passages had been sealed up years ago. Nobody knows how many women he'd watched, how many private moments he'd stolen. I changed my name legally last year, deleted all my social media, got a remote job so I could move whenever I felt unsafe. Maybe that makes him win in some way, changing my whole life because of what he did. But at least now when I check my locks at night, when I inspect my walls for signs of tampering, I know I'm not crazy. Sometimes being paranoid means you're paying attention. At 26, I finally had enough saved up for a down payment on a small house in Riverside Heights, about 40 minutes outside of Chicago. It was early October 2022, and after years of cramped apartments with paper-thin walls and neighbors who treated midnight like party hour, I was ready for some peace and quiet. The place wasn't much to look at. A single-story ranch from the 70s with faded yellow siding and a kitchen that screamed for renovation. But it had a decent backyard, a detached garage, and most importantly, it was mine. I'd been working as a network technician for a medical billing company for 4 years, pulling overtime whenever I could, eating ramen more nights than I'd like to admit, all for this moment. The neighborhood seemed perfect too, mostly older folks who'd lived there since the houses were built, the kind of people who kept their lawns pristine and waved when you drove past. The first few days were everything I'd imagined. I spent my evenings unpacking boxes, setting up my gaming setup in the spare bedroom, and actually enjoying the silence. No more bass thumping through the ceiling, no more couples fighting in the hallway at 3 a.m. Just the occasional car passing by and the rustling of the huge oak tree in my backyard. But on my 4th morning there, a Wednesday if I remember right, I stepped out onto the back porch with my coffee and noticed something weird. There were muddy footprints across the wooden deck, big ones, maybe size 11 or 12 boots. They started at the edge of the porch near the yard, went right up to my sliding glass door, and then traced back the same way. Thing is, we hadn't had rain in over 2 weeks. The yard was bone dry, the grass actually starting to yellow in spots. I walked around the entire property but couldn't find any mud anywhere. No leaky hose, no wet spots. Nothing that would explain where someone could have gotten their boots that filthy. I grabbed some paper towels and cleaned them up, figuring maybe someone got confused and came to the wrong house. The neighborhood had a lot of similar-looking ranches, and I'd already gotten mail for the previous owner twice. But the next morning, there they were again. Same muddy prints, same path. From the yard to my sliding door and back. This time I took photos with my phone. The mud was this weird reddish-brown color, almost like clay, with deep tread marks that had these distinctive diagonal lines through them. I posted about it on the neighborhood Facebook group, trying to keep it light, just asking if anyone else had seen someone wandering around at night. Most responses were about checking my cameras, which I didn't have yet, or suggestions about getting a motion light. But one comment caught my attention. Mrs. Donovan from 2 streets over mentioned that the previous owner, a guy named Carl, had moved out pretty suddenly after living there for less than a year. She didn't say why, just that one day his moving truck showed up and he was gone by evening. That afternoon, I installed a motion sensor light I picked up from Home Depot, one of those LED floodlights that could probably blind a pilot flying overhead. I also spread some flour across the porch before bed, an old trick my grandmother taught me for catching mice in the pantry. Figured it might show more detail than the wooden boards. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. Around 2 a.m., the motion light kicked on. I practically fell out of bed rushing to the window, but by the time I pulled the curtain aside, the backyard was empty. Just that harsh white light illuminating the grass and the oak trees' twisted shadows. I stood there for probably 10 minutes watching, waiting, but nothing moved. When I finally went back to bed, I left the curtain cracked just enough to see if the light triggered again. The next morning, the flower told a different story. The footprints were there, but this time I could see exactly what happened. The boot prints came from the yard like before, but in the flower I could see where they'd stood, right at my sliding door. For a long time, based on how the flower was compressed and scattered. There were these weird marks too, like someone had been kneeling or crouching, and thin lines where fingers had traced along the glass. The worst part was a clear spot in the flower, roughly face-shaped, where someone had pressed close enough to the door that their breath had blown the flower away. They'd been looking inside, into my living room, where I'd fallen asleep on the couch the night before while watching Netflix. I called the police that morning, but they didn't seem too concerned. The officer who came by, a younger guy who looked fresh out of the academy, took some notes, suggested I get security cameras, and mentioned that break-ins were pretty rare in the neighborhood. He theorized it might be kids playing pranks, or maybe someone confused, possibly intoxicated. I took the day off work and drove to Best Buy, dropped almost $800 on a security system with 4 cameras. Spent the whole afternoon setting them up, one covering the front door, one on each side of the house, and one with a perfect view of the back porch and sliding door. The app sent alerts straight to my phone, and I could watch the feeds live from anywhere. That night, I made sure all the doors were locked, even pushed my kitchen table against the sliding door as an extra barrier. I lay in bed with my phone propped up on the nightstand, the camera feeds displayed in a grid. The backyard was clearly visible in the infrared mode, everything washed in that eerie black and white. Around 11 p.m., I was starting to drift off when I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like metal on glass. My eyes shot to the phone screen, and there he was. A man standing at my sliding door, working something thin between the door and the frame. He was wearing dark coveralls, like a mechanic or janitor might wear, and work boots, the source of those muddy prints, no doubt. But his face was what made my chest tighten. He looked completely normal, maybe mid-40s, clean-shaven with thinning hair. Not some wild-eyed crazy person like you'd expect. He was focused, methodical, occasionally glancing up at the camera like he knew it was there but didn't care. And then he started talking. I couldn't hear him clearly through the glass in the distance from my bedroom, but I could see his mouth moving. I turned up the volume on the camera app, and that's when I heard it. My name. He was repeating my name, soft and steady, like he was calling a scared animal. "Nathan," he kept saying. "Nathan, just open up. We need to talk, Nathan." The thing is, I hadn't put my name on the mailbox yet. No packages had been delivered. I'd only told a couple neighbors my first name in passing, but somehow this guy knew it, standing there at midnight, trying to jimmy my door while whispering my name like we were old friends. I called 911 immediately, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. The dispatcher said units were on the way, told me to stay where I was and not confront the intruder. Through the camera, I watched him suddenly stop and tilt his head, like he was listening to something. Then he pulled out a flip phone, weird detail that stuck with me, checked it, and calmly walked away from the door. Not rushed, not panicked, just a casual stroll across my yard and into the darkness beyond the camera's range. By the time the police arrived 6 minutes later, he was long gone. They searched the area, took the camera footage, and this time they seemed to take it more seriously. The officer in charge, a sergeant named Reeves, asked me if I had any enemies, any stalkers, anyone who might want to harm me. I couldn't think of anyone. I'd lived a pretty boring life. Work, home, gaming with friends online, occasional dates that never went anywhere. Nothing that would make someone target me like this. Sergeant Reeves suggested I stay somewhere else for the night, but I was stubborn. This was my house, the place I'd worked years to afford, and I wasn't going to let some creep drive me out after less than a week. Instead, I moved my laptop setup to the living room where I could watch the sliding door directly, grabbed my old baseball bat from the garage, and settled in for a long night. The police said they'd have a patrol car swing by every hour or so. Around 3 a.m., fighting to stay awake with my 5th cup of coffee, I noticed something on the camera feed. The man was back, but this time he wasn't alone. There was someone else with him, smaller, wearing what looked like a hooded raincoat even though it was a clear night. They stood at the edge of my property, just barely in view of the side camera. The man in coveralls was pointing at different windows, at the garage, making gestures like he was explaining something. The smaller figure nodded along, and then they did something that made my whole body go rigid. They both turned and looked directly at the camera, directly at me through the screen, and waved. A slow, deliberate wave, like they were saying hello to an old friend. I was already dialing 911 when they started walking toward the house. Not toward the back door this time, but around to the front. On my phone screen, I watched them disappear from one camera and appear on the next. The woman, I could see now it was a woman under the hood, was carrying something in her hand. Through the front door camera, I saw her kneel down and place it on my welcome mat while the man stood watch. Then they both walked away, unhurried, down the sidewalk like a couple out for an evening stroll. The police arrived faster this time, maybe 4 minutes, and when they checked the front door, they found what she'd left. It was a manila envelope with Nathan written on it in neat handwriting. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Pictures of me at my old apartment, at work, at the grocery store, at the gym. Some were recent, from just days before I moved. Others were older, going back months. In every single one, no matter where I was or what I was doing, there in the background were those same 2 people. Sometimes barely visible, sometimes obvious once you knew to look for them. They'd been watching me long before I ever bought this house. The police took it seriously now. Sergeant Reeves called in detectives, and they had me go through every photo, trying to identify locations and dates. One detective, a woman named Foster, noticed something I hadn't. In 3 of the photos, there was a partial license plate visible on a van in the background. Always the same van, a white Ford Transit with rust spots along the wheel wells. They ran the plates and got a hit. The van was registered to a Carl Brennan, the same Carl who'd lived in my house before me. The previous owner. Detective Foster pulled his driver's license photo, and I immediately recognized him as the man in coveralls. Turns out Carl had never actually sold the house. He'd been evicted after failing to pay the mortgage for 8 months, and the bank had foreclosed. The house sat empty for 2 months before being sold to me through a standard auction. Carl had apparently been convinced the bank had stolen his home illegally, and according to some posts they found on his social media, he believed whoever bought it was part of the conspiracy. The woman was his sister, Joyce, who'd lost her job as a nurse after failing a psych evaluation 2 years prior. They picked them both up that same morning at a motel about 10 miles away. In their room, police found notebooks full of information about me. My daily routines, my license plate, my work schedule, even what kind of coffee I ordered at Starbucks. They had printed out my LinkedIn, my old dating profiles, even forum posts I'd made years ago about gaming builds. But the most disturbing thing was a floor plan of my house, Carl's house as he saw it, with notes about which windows were easiest to force, which rooms had the best hiding spots, and a detailed schedule of when I was most likely to be asleep. They'd been planning something, though neither would say what during questioning. Both of them were charged with stalking and attempted breaking and entering. Carl got 18 months in county jail. Joyce got 12 with mandatory psychiatric treatment. I thought about moving immediately, but the detective convinced me to stay, said they'd keep an eye on the place. I installed more locks, a security bar for the sliding door, and even got a dog, a German Shepherd mix named Duke who barks at everything. It's been over a year now, and I still check those cameras obsessively every night before bed. Sometimes I wonder if I'm really alone, or if someone else is out there, watching, waiting for their turn to claim what they think is theirs. I never thought buying that house in Oakwood would turn my life into a nightmare. But sometimes the worst things hide in the most ordinary places. It was late spring of 2016, about 2 years after my wife passed away from cancer, and I finally felt ready to leave our old home behind. Too many memories in every corner, you know what I mean? I found this place on Willow Drive through a realtor friend who gave me a great deal. A single-story ranch with a pool and a huge backyard, perfect for starting fresh. The previous owner, an elderly man named Harold Finch, had apparently moved to Florida in a hurry to be closer to his daughter. The house had been sitting empty for about 8 months before I moved in, and honestly, it showed. The grass was knee-high, leaves clogged the pool, and there was this old wooden shed at the far corner of the yard that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The first few weeks were pretty normal, just me fixing things up, cleaning out the pool, trying to make the place feel like home. I remember it was a Saturday morning in June when I first noticed something weird about the area near the shed. I was out there with my mower trying to tackle that overgrown mess of a lawn, when I hit this spot about 15 feet from the shed, where the ground just gave way a little. Not like a sinkhole or anything dramatic, but the mower wheels sank down maybe 3 or 4 inches, and when I pulled it back, there was this depression in the earth. The grass there was different too, darker, thicker, growing in this strange circular pattern maybe 6 feet across. I figured maybe there used to be a septic tank there or something, made a mental note to check it out later, and kept mowing. But then I caught this smell, faint at first, like rotting vegetables mixed with something chemical. It got stronger the closer I got to that soft spot, so I decided to leave that section for another day. That smell didn't go away. Over the next few days, especially when the sun hit that part of the yard in the afternoon, it would drift across to the patio where I like to sit with my coffee. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was persistent, like when you leave meat in the trash too long during summer. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was probably just decomposing roots from an old tree or maybe a dead animal under the ground. But here's the thing that really bothered me. My neighbor, Mrs. Hoffman, this sweet lady in her 70s who'd lived there for 30 years. She came by one afternoon with a casserole and mentioned something odd. She said Harold had been such a meticulous gardener, always out there tending to every inch of that yard, except for that one corner by the shed. In all the years she'd known him, she'd never once seen him plant anything there, or even walk on that patch of ground. She thought maybe he kept chemicals there that killed the soil or something. I couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Hoffman said. So the next morning, a Monday, I grabbed a shovel from the garage and decided to dig a small test hole, just to see what was down there. The ground was surprisingly easy to break through. Not hard-packed like the rest of the yard, but loose, almost fluffy, like it had been turned over before and never properly compressed. About a foot down, the soil changed color, went from brown to this grayish black, and the smell hit me like a punch to the gut. It was sweet and rotten and metallic all at once, nothing like any dead animal I'd ever encountered. I kept digging, telling myself I'd stop at 2 feet, but then my shovel hit something that made a dull, hollow sound. Not like hitting a rock or a pipe, softer, but solid. I scraped away more dirt and saw what looked like dirty, yellowed plastic sheeting, the heavy-duty kind contractors use, wrapped around something underneath. My first instinct was to pull the whole thing out, but something made me stop. The shape under the plastic was wrong, too long, too irregular to be a bag of chemicals or dead pet. I got down on my knees and used my hands to clear more dirt away, and that's when I saw it through a tear in the plastic. What looked like fabric, maybe denim, stained dark and clinging to something beneath. My mouth went completely dry, and I sat back on my heels, just staring at that hole for probably 5 minutes, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. But the more I looked, the more certain I became. The shape was about 6 feet long, maybe a bit less, curved in the middle like someone curled up on their side. I pulled out my phone with dirt-caked fingers and almost called 911 right then, but stopped myself. What if I was wrong? What if it was just old clothes wrapped around construction waste or something? I decided I needed to know for sure before calling anyone, so I carefully peeled back a corner of the plastic where it was already torn. The smell that came out was indescribable. Not just decay, but something chemical too, like formaldehyde mixed with soil. Underneath was definitely clothing, a flannel shirt, red and black checkered, the pattern still visible despite the staining. And below that, partially visible through another tear in the fabric, was something pale and waxy looking that made every hair on my body stand up. It was skin, or what was left of it, preserved in some weird way by whatever chemicals had been used. I scrambled backwards so fast I fell on my ass, phone tumbling into the grass. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911. My voice probably shaking as I told them I'd found what I thought was a body in my backyard. The dispatcher kept me on the line, asking me questions I could barely focus on answering, while I stared at that hole, at that thing I'd uncovered, wondering who the hell was buried in my yard. The police showed up within 15 minutes. 2 patrol cars at first, then a detective in an unmarked sedan, then the crime scene van. They taped off my entire backyard like something out of a TV show, yellow tape stretching from my fence to the house. The detective, a woman named Detective Walsh with gray streaks in her hair and these intense green eyes, asked me to walk her through everything from the beginning while the forensics team set up a tent over the hole. I told her about Harold Finch, about the soft ground, the smell, Mrs. Hoffman's comments about him avoiding that area. She wrote everything down in this little notebook, occasionally asking me to clarify details. When I mentioned Harold had moved to Florida, she exchanged a look with one of the uniformed officers that made my chest tighten. "We'll need to verify that," she said carefully. And that's when it hit me. Nobody had actually seen Harold leave. The realtor had handled everything through power of attorney with his supposed daughter. By late afternoon, they'd excavated a much larger area, and what they found turned my quiet retirement plans into a living nightmare. It wasn't just one body. There were 3, all wrapped in the same plastic sheeting, all in different stages of decay. The forensics guy, who looked way too young to be doing that job, explained to Detective Walsh within my earshot that based on the preservation and insect activity, they'd been there for different lengths of time. The oldest one, maybe 5 or 6 years. The newest, probably less than 2. That meant Harold had been living above them, walking over them every day while he played the role of the friendly neighborhood retiree. The detective showed me photos on her tablet, missing persons reports from the area going back years. One was a traveling salesman named Robert Price, who disappeared in 2014. Another was a homeless veteran called Tommy, who used to hang around the local shopping center. The third one they couldn't identify yet, but the clothing suggested it was a woman. The investigation moved fast after that. Detective Walsh had officers canvassing the neighborhood, and what they learned painted a disturbing picture of Harold Finch. Several neighbors remembered him having visitors who never seemed to leave through the front door. He'd tell people they were relatives passing through, or old friends from his military days, but nobody ever saw them actually depart. Mrs. Hoffman remembered one specific incident from about 18 months ago. A young woman with a green backpack had knocked on Harold's door asking about yard work, and Harold had invited her in to discuss it over coffee. Mrs. Hoffman never saw her leave, but Harold was out there the next morning, working near the shed with his wheelbarrow and bags of lime. At the time, she thought he was just doing garden maintenance. The detective also discovered that Harold's supposed daughter in Florida didn't exist. The power of attorney documents were forged. The Florida address was fake, and the money from the house sale had been transferred to an offshore account that vanished into a maze of shell companies. They brought in cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar after that, searching every inch of the property. The dogs went crazy near the basement wall on the north side of the house, and when they broke through the concrete, they found another plastic-wrapped bundle, this one much older, probably from the early 2000s based on the clothing. The basement discovery changed everything because property records showed Harold had only bought the house in 2008. That meant the previous owner, or someone before Harold, had started this horrific pattern. Detective Walsh spent hours going through old records and found that the house had changed hands 4 times since 1995, always sold quickly, always for cash, always to single men who lived alone. Each owner had left suddenly for family emergencies or job opportunities elsewhere. The FBI got involved at that point, suspecting we'd stumbled onto something much bigger than just Harold Finch. They thought maybe this house had been used by some kind of network, passed between people who shared certain dark interests, though they wouldn't tell me more than that. The investigation went on for 3 weeks. They found a total of 7 bodies on the property, 4 in the yard, 1 in the basement, and 2 more under the concrete slab of the garage. The forensics team practically took the house apart looking for evidence, pulling up floorboards, checking inside walls, going through the attic insulation. They found journals hidden in the shed, wrapped in waterproof bags, containing detailed records that went back 20 years. Different handwriting styles, different authors, but all documenting the same sick activities. The FBI agent in charge, a tall guy named Special Agent Rivers with this exhausted look like he'd seen too much, finally explained that they believed the house had been a designated disposal site for a group that operated across state lines. Harold had been the last caretaker, and when things got too hot, maybe he got spooked by something or someone was getting suspicious, he'd arranged his own disappearance. They traced him eventually, not to Florida but to Quebec, living under a false identity. The Canadian authorities arrested him 3 weeks after the first body was discovered, found him in a modest apartment with hair dyed black and 20 pounds lighter, but they identified him through fingerprints. The trial was all over the news, but I couldn't bring myself to follow it closely. I moved out the day the FBI cleared the scene, stayed in a motel for 2 months while I sorted out the legal mess of breaking the lease. The property management company refunded everything and then some. They were terrified of lawsuits. I found a small apartment downtown, somewhere with no yard, no basement, just the 3rd floor of a building where I could hear my neighbors living their normal lives through the walls. Harold Finch got 4 life sentences, no possibility of parole, and gave up names of others in exchange for being kept in protective custody. 12 more arrests followed across 6 states. But here's what keeps me awake at night. In his confession, Harold said the house on Willow Drive wasn't the only one. There were others, scattered across the country, innocent-looking homes with well-maintained lawns and friendly neighbors who'd wave when you walked by. He wouldn't say how many or where they were, just smiled this empty smile and said they'd been doing this for decades. I think about all the people house hunting right now, excited about finding their dream home, not knowing what might be buried beneath their feet. I check missing persons reports obsessively now, looking for patterns, wondering if another house somewhere is about to reveal its secrets. The FBI says they're investigating, following leads, but how do you find something like that when it's been hidden so well for so long? All I know is I'll never own another house with a yard again. The rental listing seemed perfect for us. A 2-bedroom house with a fenced backyard in a quiet neighborhood just outside Denver, Colorado. I'd been searching for months after the divorce finalized in early 2023, desperate to give my 7-year-old daughter Chloe some stability after everything we'd been through. The landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Jameson with thick glasses and a hearing aid that whistled when he talked, assured me the area was family-friendly. He kept mentioning how the previous tenants, a retired couple, had lived there peacefully for 12 years. The rent was slightly below market value, which should have been my first warning sign. But as a dental hygienist supporting a child on one income, I couldn't pass up the opportunity. We moved in on a Saturday in late August, the summer heat making everything feel heavy and slow. Chloe immediately fell in love with her new room. It had these built-in shelves perfect for her collection of ceramic horses, each one named after a different constellation. That first night, after I'd tucked her in and read her favorite book about a brave rabbit who solves mysteries, I sat on our worn leather couch, feeling genuinely hopeful for the first time in months. The house smelled like fresh paint and pine sol from my cleaning frenzy, and through the kitchen window, I could see fireflies dancing in the backyard. I remember thinking how different everything felt from our cramped apartment downtown, how the silence here was almost unsettling after years of sirens and traffic. Around 11, I did my usual routine of checking all the locks twice, a habit from the apartment days, and noticed nothing unusual except for a cat sitting on the fence post, its eyes reflecting green in the porch light. Monday morning changed everything. I stepped out to grab the newspaper. Yes, this neighborhood still had actual paper delivery, and nearly tripped over what was scattered on our front steps. 7 cigarette butts, all the same brand with gold filters, arranged almost deliberately in a semicircle. Next to them sat 3 beer bottles, the labels peeled off in long strips and stuffed inside like someone had nervous hands and too much time. The bottles were still damp with morning dew, but when I picked one up, I could smell stale beer mixed with something else. Cologne, maybe, that musky kind older men wear. My first thought was teenagers, maybe kids from the neighborhood testing boundaries with the new residents. I grabbed a grocery bag and cleaned it all up before Chloe could see, telling myself it was probably a one-time thing, maybe even meant for a different house. But it happened again Wednesday morning, except this time there were 9 cigarette butts and 4 bottles, plus a crumpled receipt from a gas station dated 2:47 a.m. The receipt had a coffee stain on it and listed items I'll never forget: zip ties, latex gloves, and a flashlight. My chest got tight reading it, but I kept rationalizing. Maybe someone dropped it by accident. Maybe it blew over from another yard. I called the non-emergency police line, and the officer who answered sounded barely awake, probably pulling the night shift. He took my report with the enthusiasm of someone filling out paperwork for a lost cat. Said they'd have someone patrol the area more frequently. I didn't mention the receipt details because I felt stupid, paranoid, like one of those women who overreacts to everything after watching too many true crime documentaries. That afternoon, I installed a Ring doorbell camera with my own shaking fingers and a YouTube tutorial, dropping the screwdriver twice because I kept looking behind me at every little sound. Friday night was when everything escalated beyond my ability to rationalize. Chloe had been complaining about a toothache all day, so I gave her children's Tylenol and tucked her in early, around 7:30. Her room faced the backyard, and I always kept her curtains closed at night. Another leftover paranoia from apartment living. I was in the living room folding laundry and watching a cooking show, the kind where they make impossible desserts in impossible time frames, when I heard it. This breathing sound, heavy and deliberate, right outside Chloe's window. Not like someone who'd been running, more like someone trying to breathe quietly but failing, the way my ex-husband used to sound when he'd come home drunk and try to sneak past me sleeping on the couch. The breathing had a rhythm to it. 3 deep inhales, a pause, then a long exhale that fogged up the glass. I could see the condensation forming on the window from where I stood frozen in the hallway. I grabbed my phone and the baseball bat I kept behind my bedroom door, my bare feet silent on the carpet as I crept toward Chloe's room. She was still asleep, curled up with her stuffed elephant named Mr. Peanuts, completely unaware. The breathing continued, and now I could hear something else, fingernails dragging across the window screen in slow, deliberate lines. Through a gap in the curtains, I saw a shadow, distinctly human, wearing what looked like a baseball cap pulled low. The figure wasn't trying to break in, just standing there, breathing and touching the window like they were trying to memorize its dimensions. My finger hovered over 911, but then I heard footsteps moving away from the window, heavy boots on gravel, heading toward the side of the house where my bedroom was. The motion sensor light clicked on, flooding the side yard with harsh white light, and the footsteps quickened but didn't run. Whoever it was had been here before, knew exactly where they were going. Then came the sound that made every hair on my body stand up. The doorknob to the back door turning slowly, testing. A pause. Then the front doorknob. Another pause. The sliding glass door to the patio rattling gently in its track. He was methodical, patient, moving from entry point to entry point like he had a checklist. I finally called 911, whispering to the dispatcher while creeping to each door and window to make sure they were locked. The woman on the line kept asking me to speak up, but I was terrified he'd hear me. No, I was awake and aware. Through the peephole in the front door, I saw him clearly for the first time. A man maybe in his 40s, wearing dark work clothes and that baseball cap I'd glimpsed earlier. He had this perfectly ordinary face, the kind you'd see at a hardware store or pumping gas, except for his eyes. Even from that distance through that tiny lens, I could see they were completely focused, studying my door locks like they were a puzzle he was determined to solve. The testing of the locks went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes according to my phone log. He'd try a door, wait, listen, then move to the next one. At the garage door, he spent extra time, and I heard metal scraping, maybe a screwdriver or a pick. I was standing in the hallway between Chloe's room and mine, bat in one hand, phone in the other, when I heard him at my bedroom window. This time he wasn't just breathing, he was talking so quiet I could barely make out the words. "I know you're awake," he said, his voice calm and almost friendly, like we were neighbors chatting over a fence. "Your breathing changed when you heard me. You stopped folding that laundry. Blue towel in your hands, right? The one with the dolphins on it." My legs nearly gave out because he was right. I'd been holding Chloe's dolphin beach towel when I first heard him. He'd been watching through the windows before going to Chloe's room, probably for who knows how long, learning our routines, our habits, when we were most vulnerable. "The little one takes medicine at 7:30 on Fridays," he continued, and I heard him shift positions, maybe kneeling by the window. "You always check her forehead with the back of your hand, not your palm. Sweet kid, looks just like you, especially when she scrunches her nose at vegetables." Every word made me want to scream, but I stayed silent, the dispatcher still on the line saying units were 3 minutes out. He knew things only someone who'd been watching for days would know. "You double-checked the locks, but you forgot something tonight. The bathroom window, the small one above the shower. The latch is broken, has been since before you moved in. The old couple never fixed it because who could fit through such a small space?" He laughed softly, and I heard joints popping like he was stretching. "I'm not a big man. Haven't eaten much lately. Been too busy watching, waiting for the right moment. Tonight feels right, doesn't it?" I ran to the bathroom, my feet slipping on the tile, and sure enough, the small window above the shower was unlocked, the latch hanging uselessly to one side. As I reached up to push it closed, I saw fingers, thin, dirty fingers, already gripping the outside edge, starting to push it open. I slammed my palm against them hard, heard him curse and withdraw, and managed to wedge the bat handle across the frame as a makeshift lock. His face appeared in the window for just a second, and I finally saw him clearly. Gaunt cheeks covered in patchy stubble, eyes bloodshot and wild, lips chapped and bleeding from being chewed. He smiled at me, showing yellowed teeth with gaps where some were missing. "Smart girl," he whispered. "But I've been in here before, you know. Last Sunday when you took Chloe to the farmer's market. Laid in your bed, smelled your pillows. The lavender shampoo is nice, but you should really replace that smoke detector battery in the hallway. It chirped the whole time I was here." The sirens were getting closer, and he tilted his head, listening. "They're coming up Birch Street. Be here in maybe 90 seconds. Guess I'll see you tomorrow night. Or maybe next week. I'm patient, I've got nothing but time." He disappeared from the window just as the first police cruiser pulled into my driveway, its lights painting everything red and blue. I ran to the front door, yanking it open before the officers even reached the porch, words tumbling out of me so fast they had to ask me to slow down and breathe. 2 officers searched the property while another stayed with me, taking notes as I showed him the bathroom window, the scratches on Chloe's window screen, the spots where he'd tested each lock. They found footprints in the flower bed beneath my bedroom window, cigarette butts matching the ones from my porch scattered near the fence, and something that made my knees buckle, a notebook wedged behind the garbage cans. Inside were pages and pages of observations. What time I left for work, when I picked up Chloe from school, what we ate for dinner, even notes about my phone calls that he could apparently hear through the kitchen window. The last entry, dated that morning, simply said, "Tonight after the medicine." They put out a description, but he was gone, melted back into whatever shadow he'd crawled from. We stayed in a hotel that night, and the next 5 nights after that while I broke my lease and found a new place 40 miles away. The police never found him, though they discovered he'd been living in a foreclosed house 2 streets over, mattress on the floor, walls covered with photos taken through our windows, pictures of us eating breakfast, watching TV, Chloe playing with her ceramic horses. Mr. Jameson, the landlord, finally admitted the previous tenants hadn't stayed 12 years. They'd broken their lease after 6 months, complaining about someone watching them. He'd painted over their concerns, lowered the rent, and hoped the next tenant wouldn't notice. I still check locks obsessively, installed cameras at our new place that alert my phone for any movement, and Chloe knows why we had to move, though I spared her the worst details. Sometimes I dream about that voice through the window, calm and knowing, and wake up checking the bathroom window even though this house doesn't have one above the shower. The detective called last month to say they'd found similar notebooks in 3 other cities, same handwriting, same patient observations. They think he picks single mothers, watches for weeks, maybe months, learning everything before he makes his move. "We were lucky," she said. "The others weren't. I don't feel lucky. I feel like we're just waiting for him to find us again, and this time, he already knows our patterns." My wife Jennifer and I had been hunting for houses for months when we found that colonial in rural Pennsylvania, about 40 minutes outside Pittsburgh. 8 years we'd been saving, cramming ourselves into tiny apartments, eating ramen more nights than I care to admit, all to scrape together a decent down payment. It was a 1940s house that had been sitting on the market for almost a year. Mr. Hutchinson, the elderly owner, had passed away, and his kids were practically begging someone to take it off their hands. They accepted our lowball offer so fast it should have been a red flag. But Jennifer was 7 months pregnant, and we were running out of time. We needed a place with a real nursery, not the closet we'd been calling a second bedroom in our apartment. Sure, the inspection report was a novel. Ancient wiring, pipes that belonged in a museum, windows painted shut since the Nixon administration, but nothing we couldn't tackle with some elbow grease and determination. After we moved in, every day brought a new project and a new problem. Our first week, the upstairs bathroom started leaking through the kitchen ceiling. Week 2, we discovered the previous owner had been using newspaper as insulation in the attic. Week 3, a family of raccoons decided our chimney was their new vacation home. But between all the chaos, we were making it ours, stripping away decades of floral wallpaper, sanding down original hardwood floors that had been buried under carpet since the 70s. About 6 weeks in, I decided to tackle the basement, thinking I could convert it into a proper home office. I was down there measuring for drywall when something struck me as wrong. According to my tape measure, the basement was a full 12 feet shorter than the foundation outside. When I really examined that north wall, I could see it. Different materials, newer concrete blocks, like someone had walled off a section decades after the house was built. I called Jennifer down to look at it, and she agreed something was definitely off. We spent the next hour tapping along the wall, listening for hollow spots until we found it, a section near the corner that sounded completely empty behind it. I grabbed my drill and made a small hole, just big enough to snake my phone through with the flashlight on. What I saw made no sense at first. It was a narrow corridor, maybe 3 feet wide, running along the entire length of the wall. There were wooden shelves built into one side, stocked with what looked like canned goods and gallon jugs of water. But that wasn't the strangest part. At the far end, barely visible in my phone's light, I could make out what appeared to be a small door, painted the same gray as the concrete walls, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Jennifer wanted to call someone right away, the police, the previous owner's kids, anybody, but I convinced her to let me open up the wall first. We needed to know what we were dealing with. I spent the next 3 hours with a sledgehammer and a crowbar, carefully taking down a section of the false wall. The smell hit us immediately, not death or decay, but something stale and medicinal, like a hospital room that hadn't been aired out in years. Those shelves I'd seen were stocked with enough supplies to last months. Canned soup, beans, powdered milk, boxes of crackers, all with expiration dates from 2015. There were also bottles of prescription medications, the labels too faded to read clearly, and several oxygen tanks lined up against one wall. Everything was organized meticulously, labeled with dates and contents in shaky handwriting. We made our way to that small door at the end of the corridor, Jennifer gripping my arm so tight it hurt. The door was locked with a heavy-duty deadbolt, but the key was hanging on a nail right beside it, like whoever built this wanted it to be secure from the outside, not the inside. When I opened it, we found ourselves staring into a room about the size of a large walk-in closet. There was a narrow bed pushed against one wall, neatly made with a faded quilt. A portable toilet sat in one corner, one of those camping ones, alongside several boxes of sanitary supplies. The walls were covered in photographs, dozens and dozens of them, all showing the same woman at different ages. Some looked recent, others decades old. In every photo where she appeared as an adult, she had this vacant expression, her eyes unfocused, like she wasn't really seeing the camera. What really made my gut twist was the calendar hanging above the bed, frozen on June 2015. Someone had been crossing off days with a red pen, but the marks stopped abruptly on the 18th. Next to the bed was a milk crate full of coloring books, all completely filled in with careful, childlike scrawls despite clearly being the work of an adult hand. There were puzzle books too, word searches and crosswords, hundreds of them, all completed in that same shaky handwriting we'd seen on the supply labels. Jennifer found a notebook tucked under the pillow, and when she opened it, her face went pale. Page after page of the same sentence written over and over, "I am safe here. Uncle Howard keeps me safe here. I am safe here." The writing got progressively worse as the pages went on, until the last entries were barely legible, just wavering lines trying to form words. I was still processing what we'd found when Jennifer discovered a filing box tucked behind the toilet. Inside were medical records, social security documents, and a birth certificate for someone named Dorothy Hutchinson, born in 1971. There were diagnosis papers from the early 90s, severe developmental disabilities, intermittent explosive disorder, references to violent outbursts and self-harm. But what caught my attention were the insurance papers. Apparently, Dorothy had been receiving disability benefits, and someone had been cashing those checks every month. The most recent statement was from 2015, showing regular deposits of whole $847 into an account under Howard Hutchinson's name. Howard, that must have been the Mr. Hutchinson who'd owned our house. According to the county records we'd seen during closing, he'd lived here alone since his wife died in 2008. Jennifer was already on the phone with 911 while I kept digging through the papers. There were receipts for the supplies, all paid in cash, dating back to 2010. 5 years. Someone had been keeping Dorothy in this hidden room for at least 5 years. I found medical prescriptions filled at different pharmacies across the county, never the same place twice in a row. Antipsychotics, sedatives, medications for various conditions, all prescribed to Dorothy but picked up by Howard. There was even a crude schedule taped to the inside of the filing box: when to give medications, when to bring food, when to empty the portable toilet. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in plastic, was a leather journal. Howard's journal. His handwriting was neat and precise in the beginning, talking about how Dorothy had attacked a neighbor's child, how the state wanted to institutionalize her, how he couldn't let that happen to his sister. "She's family," he wrote. "Family takes care of family, even when it's hard." The journal entries got darker as they went on. Howard wrote about Dorothy's deteriorating mental state, how she'd started refusing to eat, how she'd claw at the walls until her fingers bled. He'd had to increase her medications, sometimes doubling the doses just to keep her calm. By 2014, he was writing about his own health problems: diabetes, heart issues, difficulty making it down the stairs every day. His last entry was dated June 15th, 2015. "Dorothy hasn't spoken in 3 weeks. She just stares at the wall and rocks. I don't think she knows who I am anymore. I don't know how much longer I can do this. Maybe I should have let them take her. Maybe I was wrong. But it's too late now. Who would understand? Who would forgive this?" 3 days later, according to the calendar in Dorothy's room, someone stopped marking off the days. The police arrived within minutes, followed by detectives, forensics teams, and eventually social services. They found more than we'd discovered. There was a ventilation system Howard had rigged up, hidden behind the ceiling tiles. A baby monitor mounted in the corner so he could watch Dorothy from upstairs. They even found a second entrance we'd missed, a hidden panel that led to the old coal cellar, probably how he'd gotten her in and out without neighbors noticing. The detective told us they'd tracked down Howard's kids, who lived out of state. They swore they had no idea Dorothy even existed. Their father had told them his sister died in a car accident in the 90s. They'd never questioned why he lived alone in such a big house, why he never wanted them to visit, why he always met them at restaurants or their homes instead. The retirement home where Howard spent his final years confirmed he'd never mentioned having a sister during his stay there. They searched for Dorothy for weeks. The FBI got involved, thinking maybe Howard had moved her somewhere before going into the retirement home. They checked every hospital, every morgue, every Jane Doe case from 2015 onward. Nothing. The investigation revealed that Howard had been admitted to the retirement home in early 2016 after a severe stroke left him partially paralyzed. His children had found him collapsed in the house and made the arrangements. They'd hired a company to clean out what they thought was just hoarding in the basement. But those workers had only cleared the main area, never noticing the false wall. Dorothy had simply vanished somewhere between June 2015 and Howard's stroke in 2016. The detective's theory was that she'd died in that room, and Howard, in his deteriorating mental state, had somehow disposed of the body. But they never found any evidence. No DNA, no signs of violence. Nothing to indicate what had happened during those final months. We couldn't stay in that house. Even after the investigation ended, even after contractors opened up all the walls to make sure there were no other hidden spaces, we couldn't sleep there. Jennifer started having panic attacks every time she went into the basement. I'd lie awake at night thinking about Dorothy in that room, crossing off days on her calendar, writing those same words over and over while her mind slipped away. We sold the house at a massive loss and moved back into an apartment. The new owners were some young couple who thought they were getting a deal, just like we had. I wanted to warn them, but what would I say? That technically nothing supernatural happened there? That it was just human cruelty, the kind that happens behind closed doors every day? Sometimes I drive past the house and wonder if they've felt it yet, that weight in the basement, that wrongness in the air. Or maybe they've already found something we missed. Maybe there are more secrets in that house waiting behind other walls. All I know is that every time I see a "For sale by owner" sign now, especially on an old house with a too good price, I think about Dorothy Hutchinson and drive a little faster. Last spring, my wife Ashley and I finally saved enough to buy our first house. It was April, and we'd been married for just over 2 years, both of us teaching at the local high school in a small town in Ohio. The house was a foreclosure, which explained the price. A 1940s two-story colonial that had been empty for almost 3 years. The realtor, Mrs. Blackwood, was this tiny woman with silver hair pulled back so tight it made her eyes look surprised all the time. She kept mentioning how motivated the bank was to sell, practically pushing the keys into our hands. We should have asked more questions, but we were too excited about the hardwood floors, the original crown molding, and that huge backyard where we imagined our future kids would play. The inspection came back mostly clean, just some old pipes that would need replacing eventually, and a furnace that had maybe 5 good years left in it. The first week after moving in was a blur of unpacking boxes and arguing about where the couch should go. It was a Saturday morning when we decided to tackle the basement. We needed space for Ashley's photography equipment, and the basement seemed perfect. It was surprisingly dry for such an old house, with those thick stone walls that stayed cool even as spring turned warmer. There were 3 separate rooms down there, plus the main area where the previous owners had started building what looked like a workshop. The first room had shelves lining the walls, perfect for storage. The second was smaller, with a single window near the ceiling that let in these thin streams of dusty light. But the third door, tucked into the far corner where the stone walls met, that one was different. 4 industrial-sized slide bolts were drilled into the door frame, all on the outside, the kind you'd see on a barn door but heavier, more serious. The wood around them was splintered and damaged, like they'd been installed in a hurry, without much care for appearance. Ashley ran her fingers along the bolts while I grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox we'd brought down. The metal was cold and rough with rust, but not ancient rust. Maybe 10, 15 years old at most. What really made my chest tighten was realizing that each bolt was positioned at a different height. One near the floor, one at waist level, another at shoulder height, and the last one almost at the top of the frame. Whoever installed these wanted to make absolutely sure that door stayed shut. I remember Ashley made this nervous laugh, the kind she does when she's trying to pretend something doesn't bother her, and said we should probably just leave it alone, maybe call the realtor first. But I was already working the crowbar under the first bolt. The screws came out easier than expected, like the wood had gone soft around them. Each bolt made this awful screech as I pried it loose, metal grinding against metal, until finally all 4 were off and piled on the concrete floor, like broken fingers. The door itself was heavier than it looked, solid oak that had warped slightly over the years. It took both of us pulling to get it open, and when it finally gave way, this stale, thick air rushed out. Not rotten or moldy, but old and wrong somehow, like opening a jar that had been sealed too long. The room was maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, no windows, just bare concrete walls and floor. But it wasn't empty, not really. There was a metal bed frame pushed against one wall, no mattress, just the springs all rusted and sagging in the middle. Next to it sat a pink plastic bucket, the kind kids use at the beach, and beside that, several water bottles, all different brands, some still half full with liquid that had turned yellowish. The walls, though, that's what made Ashley grab my arm hard enough to leave marks. Starting about 3 feet from the floor and going up almost to my eye level, there were scratches everywhere. Not random scratches, but deliberate ones, grouped in sets of 5, like someone had been counting days, maybe weeks. In the corner farthest from the door, there was a pile of fabric that turned out to be clothes. A faded yellow sundress with tiny daisies on it, a pair of jeans that looked like they'd fit a teenager, some t-shirts, all of them dusty and stiff. But underneath the clothes, that's where things got worse. There were notebooks, 3 of them, those black and white composition books kids use in school. The pages were wrinkled and torn, covered in handwriting that started neat and careful but gradually became frantic, harder to read. The same phrase appeared over and over on some pages. He says I'm getting better, but I'm not sick. Other pages had drawings, crude sketches of a window, always the same window with 4 panes and curtains, drawn hundreds of times like someone trying to remember what the outside looked like. Ashley was already backing toward the door, but I kept reading, finding grocery lists written in different handwriting, probably mail, with items like crackers for downstairs and more batteries for the lamp. At the bottom of one page, in that same neat writing that had turned desperate, someone had written, "Mom would be 47 today," with the date May 12th, but no year. I grabbed the notebooks and the clothes, stuffing everything into a garbage bag we'd brought down for cleaning. Ashley was already on her phone trying to call the realtor, but it was Saturday afternoon and nobody was answering. We stood there in our basement staring at that open door, and I noticed something else. Fresh screws holes in the doorframe on the inside, like there had been a handle there once, maybe even a lock, but from the inside. Someone had removed it before installing those bolts outside. We decided to search the rest of the house more carefully, and that's when we found more evidence. In the attic, pushed far under the insulation, there was a box of VHS tapes, each one labeled with just a date, spanning about 2 years. We don't own a VCR, but the labels were enough to make my skin prickle. The dates matched up with some of the notebook entries. There were also receipts, dozens of them, for things like protein bars, vitamins, cases of water, all purchased at different stores around the state, never the same place twice. We called the police that evening, after spending hours going through everything we'd found. 2 officers showed up, Officer Garrett and his partner, a younger woman who took notes while Garrett examined the room. They took the notebooks, the VHS tapes, everything. But Garrett pulled me aside before leaving and told me something that made my whole body go cold. About 8 years ago, a local man named Douglas Henley had reported his 16-year-old daughter Melissa missing. She'd supposedly run away after an argument about her grades. The case went cold after a few months. No signs of her, no activity on her social media, nothing. Douglas had lived in our house until 5 years ago, when he died of a heart attack at work. The house sat empty after that, tied up in legal issues because Melissa was still listed as his next of kin, technically missing but not declared dead. Garrett said they'd be testing the room for DNA, checking those notebooks for handwriting matches, but the look on his face told me he already knew what they'd find. That night, Ashley and I stayed in a hotel. We couldn't bring ourselves to sleep in that house, knowing what had happened below our bedroom, below our kitchen, below the space where we'd been planning our life together. The next morning, Garrett called to confirm what we'd suspected. The handwriting matched samples from Melissa Henley's school records. The DNA from hair found on the clothes was hers too. But here's the part that still keeps me awake sometimes. They found evidence that she'd been in that room as recently as 5 years ago, right up until Douglas died. She would have been 19 by then, locked in that basement for 3 years. The receipts showed he'd been feeding her, giving her vitamins, even buying her feminine products. In his twisted mind, he was taking care of her, protecting her from something. Maybe from growing up, from leaving him, from becoming someone he couldn't control. The police searched every database, every record they could find, but Melissa Henley had vanished completely after her father's death. She'd simply walked out of that basement and disappeared. The investigation dragged on for weeks. Detectives came and went, taking measurements, photographs, digging through county records. They found out that Douglas had installed those bolts himself. There were charges on his credit card from a hardware store, dated just 2 weeks after Melissa's disappearance. He'd told everyone she ran away, played the grieving father perfectly, even put up missing person flyers around town for the first few months. Meanwhile, she was right beneath everyone's feet, scratching those marks into the concrete walls. The VHS tapes, when they finally got them converted to digital, showed nothing but static and occasional glimpses of that basement door, filmed from the stairs like he was checking to make sure it was still locked. Hours and hours of footage of just that door. Ashley found out from a neighbor, Mrs. Coleman, that Douglas used to have loud music playing in his house all the time, said it helped him concentrate while he worked from home. Now we understood what that music was really drowning out. We couldn't sell the house, not right away, not with it being an active crime scene, and later not with everyone knowing what it was. The horror house on Sycamore, kids started calling it. Ashley and I tried to stick it out, tried to reclaim the space, but every creak of the floorboards made us think about what Melissa must have heard above her all those years. Every time we went to the basement to do laundry, we'd see that doorway, even though we'd taken the door off completely. The room stood empty and open, but it felt occupied somehow, like the weight of what happened there had soaked into the walls. We lasted 3 months before moving back in with Ashley's parents. The house is still ours, technically. We're still paying the mortgage while it sits empty. The realtor, Mrs. Blackwood, finally admitted she'd heard rumors about the previous owner but didn't think they were worth mentioning since nothing had been proven. We tried to sue, but our lawyer said we didn't have much of a case since technically, no crime had been committed in the house after Douglas died, and he was never convicted of anything while alive. Then, about 2 months ago, I got a call from Officer Garrett. They'd found her, not Melissa herself, but traces of her. She'd been working cash-only jobs, staying in motels under fake names, always moving, always running from something. A social worker in Montana had recognized her from the age progression photos the police had circulated. When they finally made contact, she was living in a tiny apartment above a laundromat, going by the name Claire. Garrett said she was physically healthy but wouldn't speak to anyone about those 3 years. Would barely acknowledge they'd happened at all. The only thing she said about her father was that he'd convinced her the world had ended, that there'd been some kind of nuclear disaster, and he was keeping her safe in the only place that wasn't contaminated. He'd wear a fake radiation suit when he brought her food, told her everyone she knew was dead, that going outside would kill her in minutes. The day he died, his employer had called the house phone repeatedly when he didn't show up. She heard it ringing above her for hours before the sound finally stopped. It took her 2 more days to work up the courage to try the door, only to find it had been unlocked the whole time. The bolts were just for show by then, just part of maintaining the lie. The state pressed charges posthumously, more for the record than anything else. Ashley and I finally sold the house last month at a massive loss to a property developer who plans to tear it down. They're going to build 2 smaller houses on the lot, fresh starts with no basements. Melissa, Claire now, she sent us a letter through her social worker, just 1 line. I hope you can make good memories there. We couldn't bring ourselves to tell her we'd already left, that nobody could make good memories in a place like that. Sometimes I drive by the lot, especially now that they've started demolition. Yesterday I watched them fill in the basement with concrete, truck after truck of it, like they were burying something that should have never existed. Ashley says I need to stop going back, that we need to move forward, and she's right. But every time I see a basement door with a lock on it, even a normal one, even from the inside, I think about Melissa counting days in sets of 5 on those walls, waiting for a world to end that had already ended for her the moment her father decided she belonged to him forever. Moving into that old house felt like hitting the reset button. My daughter Emily was 7 at the time, full of energy and curiosity, and I was determined to make the place ours. It was a small 2-story home on a quiet street, the kind of property that needed more elbow grease than money to bring it back to life. I was juggling a full-time job and parenting alone, so every free hour went into sanding walls, pulling up old carpets, and painting while Emily sat nearby with her crayons. Life was messy but steady, and in those first few weeks the noise of hammers and the smell of fresh paint became our soundtrack. One Saturday afternoon, while pulling up the warped floorboards in the upstairs hallway, I noticed something wedged between the beams. At first I thought it was just trash left behind by the previous owners, maybe scraps of wallpaper or an old shopping list. But the papers were folded neatly, stacked together like they had been hidden there deliberately. The handwriting was cramped and slanted, written in blue ink that had faded slightly. The first page started with a simple line: "Lights out at 10:37, curtains drawn at 10:42. My initial reaction was confusion. It didn't take long to realize these weren't random notes. They were observations. The deeper I read, the more unsettling it became. The notes listed out times, actions, and even descriptions of the people who had lived there before us. Man leaves for work, 7:12. Wife smokes on back porch, 7:34. Child bikes around block, 3:15. It was all written in obsessive detail, down to the brand of cereal boxes left on the counter and the exact color of shirts worn. I could almost picture someone sitting in the shadows, jotting everything down. My chest tightened as I flipped through the stack, realizing it covered weeks, maybe months, of these people's daily lives. Whoever wrote this hadn't just been curious, they had been watching. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about those notes. Lying in bed, I kept replaying the words in my head, the way every movement had been cataloged like entries in a twisted logbook. Emily slept soundly in the next room, unaware, but I found myself getting up twice just to check her window locks. I told myself the stalker had probably been long gone, that the notes were just remnants of another family's nightmare, not mine. Still, there was something about the way they had been tucked away so carefully under the floorboards, as if meant to be found later, that made it hard to shake the unease. 2 days later, I was in the kitchen making dinner when I caught myself glancing at the window above the sink more than usual. The blinds were open just enough for someone to see inside if they wanted. That thought crawled into my mind and stayed there, so I pulled the cord and let the slats fall shut. Emily came bouncing in, asking if she could ride her bike before it got dark. I almost said no, but I didn't want her to notice my uneasiness. Instead, I told her to stay close, circling the driveway where I could keep an eye on her. Even then, I found myself stepping outside with a dish towel still in hand, scanning the street for movement. That night, as I was folding laundry in the living room, I heard a faint scrape, like the drag of a shoe on pavement, right outside the house. I paused, listening. The sound didn't repeat, but when I peeked through the blinds, I thought I saw the faint glow of a cigarette ember across the street. Just a pinprick of light, then gone. My heart thudded hard against my ribs. I stood there in the dark, barely breathing, wondering if someone had been standing there the whole time, quietly watching. I told myself it was probably just a neighbor, but I couldn't shake the possibility that it wasn't. The following morning, a new sheet of paper slid under the front door. It wasn't folded, just laid flat, with that same tight handwriting. This time, the details weren't about the family before us. They were about me. Coffee made at 6:41. Daughter eats cereal at 7:03. Leaves porch light on until 8:12. I remember the way my fingers trembled as I held the page, the letters blurring because my eyes watered with panic. Someone had been outside close enough to see everything we did down to the minute. I locked every door and window in the house, even though it was broad daylight, and called in sick to work. Emily didn't understand why I wouldn't let her play outside that day. She kept asking, and I kept dodging, trying to keep my voice calm. I didn't want to scare her, but every time she walked near a window, I caught myself pulling her back or closing the curtains tighter. I even went upstairs and checked under the beds, inside closets, places I knew were empty, just to convince myself. Still, every corner of the house felt thinner, less private, as if whoever was writing those notes could see through the walls. That evening, after putting Emily to bed, I sat in the living room with every light off, staring at the front door. I wanted to catch whoever was doing this, to prove to myself it wasn't all in my head. Around midnight, there was a faint creak on the porch boards, the kind you only hear when someone steps on them. I didn't move. My pulse hammered in my ears as I watched the silhouette of paper slide under the door again. I didn't pick it up right away. I just waited, listening to footsteps retreat down the walkway, measured and unhurried, like they had no fear of being caught. When I finally bent down, I saw the page was shorter this time, just one line. Window upstairs left open at 9:26. My breath caught in my throat because Emily's window was the one facing the street, and I knew I had left it cracked earlier to air out her room. I bolted up the stairs, nearly tripping, and slammed it shut. For the first time since moving in, I sat on the edge of her bed until she stirred, brushing my sleeve against her hair as if that would shield her from whoever was outside. The house felt less like shelter and more like a glass box. The next morning, I packed a bag for Emily, and drove straight to my sister's house 2 towns over. I didn't even leave a note behind. From there, I called the police, who agreed to check the property. They found no one, no sign of forced entry, and no fingerprints on the papers. The officers told me to be cautious, but admitted they couldn't do much without catching someone in the act. When I asked if they had seen the notes, one of them looked uncomfortable and simply said, "We've seen cases like this before. Sometimes they stop as suddenly as they start." That wasn't the reassurance I was hoping for. I never went back to that house. I broke the lease, lost the deposit, and moved into a cramped apartment closer to family. It wasn't ideal, but at least I could breathe again without constantly checking windows and blinds. Emily adjusted quicker than I did. She doesn't remember much beyond me being extra worried back then. I still think about those notes sometimes, about the fact that someone had been close enough to track our lives minute by minute. The papers are still with the police, but no one ever called me with updates. To this day, I don't know who was watching us or why, but I'm certain of one thing. If I hadn't found those notes under the floorboards, I might never have realized we were being observed until it was too late. It didn't take long after moving into that neighborhood for me to notice something strange about the house directly across from ours. At first glance, it was practically a mirror image of the one my wife and I had just bought. Same shape, same siding, same front porch, but it carried this odd frozen quality, like it had been paused in time. The grass was cut but never freshly trimmed. The windows were intact but always dull with dust, and the mailbox leaned at an angle that looked permanent. Neighbors waved politely when we settled in, but no one ever mentioned that house, almost as if it wasn't worth bringing up. During the day, it looked harmless enough. Kids rode their bikes past it without even glancing at the porch, and delivery trucks never stopped there. My wife Claire joked that it was the ghost twin of our home, which made me laugh at the time. Still, I found myself glancing at its windows more than I'd like to admit. The blinds were always tilted in a way that blocked the view inside, and the front door had a heavy chain across it, something you don't often see on suburban homes, unless someone really doesn't want visitors. The first time I saw a light inside, I thought I had imagined it. It was close to midnight, and I had gone downstairs to grab a glass of water. Through our living room window, I noticed a faint glow. Not bright like a lamp, but more like the flicker of a television. I stood there for a good minute, trying to figure out if it was just the streetlight reflecting, but then it shifted, like someone had walked in front of it. I told myself maybe a realtor or maintenance worker had stopped by, though it didn't explain why anyone would be there that late. A week later, it happened again, only this time Claire saw it too. She had just come out of the shower and was pulling the curtain shut in our bedroom when she called me over. There, on the second floor of the empty house, a silhouette passed in front of the window. It wasn't a trick of the light. The shape had weight to it, like a person moving with purpose from one side to the other. We stood in silence, staring, waiting for it to happen again. When nothing else moved, she whispered, "But nobody lives there, right?" I didn't know how to answer. The next morning, I casually asked one of the neighbors, a man named Frank who was out watering his lawn. I pointed at the house across the street and asked if anyone still owned it. He didn't hesitate, just shook his head quickly and said, "Nobody's been in there for years." Then he changed the subject so fast it felt rehearsed. Claire and I brought it up to a couple others over the next few days, and the reactions were the same. Dismissive shrugs, quick topic changes, a weird determination not to talk about it. That silence only made the place more impossible to ignore. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. One afternoon I walked across and circled the property. Up close, the similarities to our own home were eerie. The same shutters, the same paint color, even the same small cracks in the driveway concrete, like it had been copied and pasted. But there were subtle differences too. The porch railing had tiny scratches as though someone had dragged something heavy across it, and the back gate was padlocked with a thick rusted chain. Peering through a side window, all I could make out was darkness. though I thought I smelled something faint, like burnt plastic seeping out. That night, Claire shook me awake around 2 a.m. She whispered that she had heard a voice, faint and muffled, like someone arguing. We pressed our faces to the window and watched. The second floor glowed again, but brighter this time, as though multiple lights had flicked on at once. The shadows moved, long and stretched, crossing back and forth. We couldn't hear words clearly, just that low rumble of human sound, the rhythm of a conversation. Yet every part of me knew no one should have been there. I told her we'd ask the HOA directly in the morning. The following day, I called their office. The woman on the line checked her records and after a pause said, "That property doesn't belong to anyone anymore." I pressed for clarification, and she repeated herself, slower this time, as though trying to discourage me from asking more. "It has no owner," she said before excusing herself and hanging up. I sat there with the phone still in my hand, stunned. How could a house with working electricity, blinds that shifted, and clear signs of movement have no owner? Claire didn't want me to pursue it further, but I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. That evening I sat on the porch just to see if anything would happen. Hours went by in silence until around midnight when the house lit up again. This time the glow wasn't steady. It pulsed, like someone walking room to room, switching lights on and off. Then in the upstairs window I saw it. The blinds shifted slightly, and a pale hand pressed flat against the glass. No face appeared, no body, just that hand lingering there for several seconds before slipping out of sight. I nearly called the police but hesitated, unsure how to even explain it without sounding ridiculous. Claire begged me to stop paying attention, but the more we ignored it, the more aggressive the disturbances became. One night, all of our outdoor lights flickered off at once, even though the breakers were fine. Across the street, every window in that house blazed with light, brighter than I had ever seen before, then snapped into darkness in unison. The next morning, our mailbox was wide open, and inside was a scrap of lined paper with nothing but a circle drawn in thick black ink. Claire swore she hadn't touched it, and neither had I. The breaking point came a week later. We woke to loud pounding, steady and deliberate, echoing across the street. From our bedroom window, we could see the front door of the vacant house shaking, as if someone were slamming against it from the inside, though the heavy chain held it shut. Then the noise just stopped, mid-strike, and everything went still. No light, no movement, nothing. That silence was worse than the chaos. We sat there listening, waiting, but it never resumed. By dawn, the house looked as dead and empty as it had on the day we moved in. We decided to move out shortly after. Claire couldn't sleep anymore, and I couldn't focus on anything else. Before we left, I asked the HOA one last time if they had any explanation. The woman on the phone gave me the same answer, but this time she sounded tired. That house doesn't belong to anyone. We sold our home at a loss just to get away. Sometimes when I wake at night, I picture that hand pressed against the glass across the street, waiting, and I still wonder who or what was living in the house that no one is supposed to own.
This happened about 20 years ago when I was in my early 20s. I still think about it more than I probably should. I was living in Alaska at the time, in a small town where nothing much happened. It was around 1 or 2 in the morning, and I was driving home from a friend's place. I didn't have a driver's license back then, and the car wasn't insured. I was carrying a pistol, and there was a good chance I had drugs on me too. Because of all that, I avoided highways at night if I could. Back roads meant a lower chance of getting pulled over by a cop. That night, I took a loop road that cut through farms and a couple of small subdivisions. It was late, no moon, no streetlights, just darkness and my headlights. About halfway through the loop, there was a sharp 90-degree turn. I slowed down to maybe 15 miles an hour and eased around it. As soon as the road straightened, my headlights hit something in the middle of the road. It was a red radio flyer wagon tipped on its side. I stopped the car. For a second, I thought it had fallen out of someone's truck. Then I saw what it was around. Small clothes, a shirt, pants, and socks. They were scattered across the road and into the ditch like they'd been dumped or dragged. The clothes looked like they belonged to a kid, maybe 5 or 6 years old. On the other side of the ditch was a narrow trail leading into the woods. I just sat there with the engine running, staring at it. My first thought was that a kid had been hurt or wandered off, or worse. I kept thinking that if this were real, if there really was a kid involved, I just couldn't leave. I grabbed my pistol from the seat and got out of the car. I walked to the edge of the road and looked down into the ditch. The clothes led straight towards the trail. The woods beyond it were solid black. My headlights didn't reach far enough to help. I stood there for a long time, long enough that my arms started to feel tense. The whole thing felt staged. I had this strong sense that someone was just past the tree line, waiting to see what I would do. I couldn't hear anything, but I felt it anyways. Even with the gun in my hand, I didn't feel safe stepping off the road. Eventually, I backed away, got back in my car, and locked the doors. I drove around the wagon and didn't look back. I never reported it, and when I went back a few days later, I didn't see any clothes or wagons, even in the ditch. I don't know where the wagon came from or who put it there. I don't know if there was ever a kid involved at all. The only thing I know is that if I had followed those clothes into the woods, I don't think I would have come back. January 3rd, 2016 is a date I remember without trying. I was hunting behind my house north of Fort Bennett, Alaska. I was primarily hunting for elk, but would really shoot anything if I had the chance, including deer and bear. It was basically right out in my backyard, so I normally hunted alone, which wasn't unusual for me, and lots of Alaskans do it. That morning it was snowing, the steady kind that never really stopped. I walked out before noon with my rifle, moving slowly through the trees. Elk pass through that area every winter. I'd seen tracks the day before, fresh ones, so I decided to wait instead of walking. I found a snow buildup near a line of pines and dug myself in. I packed snow around my legs and waist to hide my scent and break my outline. Then I waited. Hours passed and the cold settled in, but I was used to it. No sign of elk or anything else yet, just snow and trees and the sound of my own breathing. I slowly scanned the woods. Everything looked the same until I caught movement near a pine tree about 50 yards out. Something moved fast, then stopped. I lifted my rifle and looked through the scope. I thought it might be a wolf or a bear moving wrong because of the snow. I waited. Something stepped out from behind a tree. I saw fur. That was enough for me. I adjusted my aim and pulled the trigger. Instead of dropping, it screamed. The sound wasn't like any animal I've heard. It was loud and sharp and deep, like it came from inside the ground. It echoed through the trees and hit me in the chest. I flinched hard and almost dropped the rifle. Then it stood fully upright. It was on 2 legs, tall, and it moved fast. It turned towards me, and I could feel it locked onto me. I pulled myself out of the snow and ran. My house wasn't far, but it felt like miles. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the brush, not slowing down. At one point, I decided to hit the deck and spun around, raising my rifle to fire another shot since it was gaining on me. It was coming out of the trees, and I fired my gun. I have no idea if I even hit it or not, but it slowed down a little either from being hit or hearing another bullet ring out. It screamed again, shorter this time, and turned away. I fired once more as it ran. While I had fired those last 2 shots, though, I had been briefly able to see its face. Its face was pale, almost white, and its eyes were white too, no color at all. Its mouth was open, and its teeth were long and thin, like needles. When it disappeared into the trees, I didn't go after it. I went inside, locked the door, and waited, watching the woods for a long time. I tried to figure out what I had just seen, and my best guess was that it was a wendigo, but I don't really know. I still hunt and live out there on that property, but I've never gone back to that clearing where I was that day or anywhere near it. I know it's still out there, and I don't want to remind it of me. I will never return to that clearing again. This story happened 7 or 8 years ago. I was a single mom living on an island in southeast Alaska. There are only 26 miles of roads on the island, so it's a small place. It was a Friday night. My kid and I were scheduled to fly out of town for a long weekend in Seattle. So I worked all day, picked up the kid, and headed to the airport. Our flight to Seattle was canceled, so we rescheduled the first trip in the morning and headed home at about 8:30 p.m. As a side note, I wasn't a fan of cell phones and did not have one yet. After this incident, I got a cell phone. We lived about 14 miles north of town. I was tired and frustrated about our canceled flight, so I was probably driving a little faster than normal. About 3 miles from home, I came up behind a dark-colored pickup truck. The truck was going slower than I was, so I slowed down, but still got a little close to the truck's bumper. I tried to pass the truck, but realized I was in a no-pass zone. The driver evidently felt I had tailgated too closely, because they slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. People occasionally do this since we only have one main road on the island. I hit the gas, pulled around the truck, and headed home. Immediately, the truck sped up and moved right up to my back bumper. I started thinking, okay, you're angry that I tailgated you. Message received. The truck did not back off. The driver turned off their headlights so I could no longer see how close they were. I increased my speed a little, hoping to get rid of this person. Then, all of a sudden, the headlights came back on, and the truck was just inches from my car. At this point, my preteen daughter started to get a little worried. She was turned in her seat looking out the back window. It was very dark with no streetlights, so we could not see anyone in the truck, which made it even creepier. The truck turned off and on their headlights several more times. Each time the lights came back on, the truck would be right on my tail. We got close to our turn off the main road into our residential neighborhood. I signaled and hoped that the truck would keep going straight. I turned, and the truck turned. Our street was about 3 blocks away, but I did not want to turn down my dark road with this angry truck following me. So I didn't turn down our street, but kept driving straight while trying to reassure my daughter that everything was okay. Less than a mile from my house was a large elementary school with basketball courts, running track, hiking trails, and a big playground. The school's driveway and parking lot were open until 10 p.m. for students and neighbors to use. I decided to drive directly to the school because there were often people there, even at 8:30 at night. I drove up to the driveway and into the parking lot of the school. There were 3 or 4 cars parked, but I didn't see any people outside. I parked between cars directly under a streetlight. The truck followed us up the driveway but didn't enter the parking lot. The truck stayed in the middle of the driveway just at the entrance of the parking lot. It was as if the driver was blocking the driveway with their truck. The driver turned off their headlights and waited in their vehicle. We waited for the truck to leave or someone to come out of the school. About 15 minutes later, the truck turned on their headlights, backed up, and drove down the school's driveway towards the main road. We were relieved, but decided to wait another 5 to 10 minutes just to be sure. We were tired and hadn't even eaten dinner yet, so eventually I started the car and decided to leave the school parking lot. It was only a few blocks from home. As we got to the end of the school driveway, I turned right towards home. There were no other cars on that street that I could see. As soon as my car made the turn, bright headlights turned on directly behind us. The truck had not left. The driver had hidden behind the driveway's gate, turned off the headlights, and waited for us. As soon as our car pulled out onto the highway, the driver turned on their headlights and high beams and rushed right up to my back bumper. To be truthful, this freaked me out. I don't get scared easily, but having that truck come right up at us with its bright white headlights in the very dark, deserted street was enough to get my adrenaline pumping. I couldn't keep driving around the neighborhood all night with the truck. This was rural Alaska, so there weren't many well-lit places with people hanging around. The only convenience store on that end of the island had already closed. Then I remembered the wonderful piece of advice that I got about driving to a fire or police station if you're being followed. The Alaska State Troopers have their headquarters along the main road back towards town, so I headed there. The troopers have cameras that cover their entire property, so I knew if we could make it to their parking lot, I could honk and be seen by the dispatcher or any officers inside the building. The truck followed us all the way to the troopers' headquarters, which was about 7 or 8 miles. When the driver saw me pull into the troopers' parking lot, he or she turned around and drove back the way they had come. I went inside the station and reported what happened. We didn't get a license plate, but I wanted law enforcement to know there was a crazy truck terrorizing people. I think if I had gone directly home, the driver would have followed me. The driver took more than 30 minutes out of their Friday night to follow us and wait around. He or she must have been really angry. Who knows if things would have escalated to violence, but I'm very thankful that we didn't take any chances that night. We did catch the flight to Seattle the next morning and had a very relaxing long weekend. I'm a woman in my late 20s who has recently decided to take my personal safety more seriously. Last winter, my boyfriend got me my first handgun as a Valentine's Day present. The same one he had, as I already had a bunch of range time with it. My boyfriend and his kids and I live 20 minutes outside of town in a small cabin in Alaska. While we're tucked away mostly by trees, we do have neighbors around us in a small neighborhood. We know most of the people who live in our loop and are familiar with everyone who takes walks around it. One morning in mid-October, we found a pack of crumpled up and mostly empty cigarettes and a couple butts scattered in our driveway. We were slightly spooked because no one we know smokes and we hadn't had any visitors. I mentioned maybe our dog had dragged them out of a neighbor's trash can since he had run off a couple times recently, but my boyfriend was still suspicious of how they were arrayed. We got a little more weary but mostly shrugged it off. I was home alone a couple of mornings later and hanging around the house in my pajamas, drinking coffee and thinking about doing some house chores. My puppy had been outside for a while, and at one point him running past a window in my bedroom caught my eye. He was stopped in the driveway in a very strange low stance, staring. I looked towards where he was facing. There in the woods, 20 feet from my house and 10 feet from my dog, was a woman. The first thing I noticed was her hands. They were outstretched at her sides and adorned with orange latex gloves. Next, I noticed her long, straight black hair, black skinny jeans, and her t-shirt cut off at the shoulders. She was standing just behind a short pile of logs with her head tilted back and her eyes closed. My brain was frozen initially. She stood there making weird movements. I got my phone out and called my boyfriend twice in rapid succession with no answer. I pulled up my camera to document, but my hands were shaking as I noticed my dog inching closer to her in curiosity. He was doing a weird back and forward dance, still in a half-curious, half-cautious pose. My mind was racing on what to do. Should I be videoing, or should I confront her first? Should I grab my gun? What if she was armed? What kind of drugs was she on? I realized I didn't want my pup to go near the crazy lady and knew my boyfriend would be so disappointed if I confronted an iffy situation unarmed. I also didn't want to escalate the situation by waving a gun around. All these thoughts rushed through my mind in rapid succession during the few seconds while I fumbled for my camera. My pup moved even closer to her, only a couple feet away, and I made up my mind. I dropped my phone on the bed and grabbed my pistol from the top of the dresser, slid it out of its holster, and pointed it down and out with my finger firmly on the trigger. I walked up to the front door and pulled it open. I stepped halfway out onto the steps with my right hand with the gun concealed behind the door. I can't for the life of me remember if I called for my dog or confronted her first, but in between every sentence I said to her, I called him back to me. The third time he listened, and I ushered him inside. I called out, "Ma'am, what are you doing?" She looked up at me mildly surprised and said kind of quietly, "Nothing." I stated, "Well, you're on my property and you're behaving very strangely." I was relieved to hear my voice was steady. She paused for a minute and said, "No, I'm going to Val's house." I asked her where Val's house was, as I was trying to get an idea of where she came from. She pointed at the house I was standing half outside of and said, "That's Val's house." I said very firmly, "No, this is my house." She responded with, "Okay, I'll leave." She started gathering objects from the ground, what looked like a red bandana, a dark sweater, and after a few seconds of watching her fumble, I realized she was putting her boots on. She stumbled through the woods towards the driveway, and I shut the door and ran for my phone. I got a video of her walking in wide zigzags down my driveway. Later watching the video, I picked up more details I hadn't noticed, like the fact that she was wearing nice pricey boots and had a full sleeve tattooed on her right arm. This was my first questionable situation since I started concealing and carrying, and I was super glad to know the safety training I'd pounded into my head stuck. We posted the video on our local group page, and one of our neighbors messaged us not long after saying they'd found her clothes in their driveway and sent pictures. We never got any more info on who she was or who her friend Val was. I checked the woods multiple times and couldn't tell if she'd been sleeping there. I can't imagine my dog would have let her go unnoticed. I went through each shed and storage place on our property for signs of activity or anything missing, and it all looked normal, but we started locking up better after that. Me and 4 other friends were moose hunting in Alaska as we do most years. This particular year we were 8 miles in with no trail and no outside noise. Everything we had was on our backs. 3 tents about 15 feet apart in a loose triangle was our camping spot for the night. 2 tents had 2 people and 1 guy slept alone. It was around day 8 of our trip. We were worn down from hiking all day and sleep usually came fast. That night though, my buddy and I both woke up in our tent at the same time. We just rolled over and looked at each other. He had the same look I did, wondering why we both woke up at the same time. About 10 seconds later, the rain started, and it turned into a sudden downpour. It was so loud it swallowed everything else. We figured maybe our bodies felt a pressure change or something, and that's why we woke up before the rain. We both turned back over to go to bed, and then through the rain we heard a voice. The voice was one of our friends, who shouted, "Hey, get out of here!" We both sat up. I yelled towards the other tents, asking if anyone was up. No answer. I yelled again and still heard nothing. At that point, I was really creeped out. We started pulling on boots and jackets, fumbling with zippers and headlamps. After a few seconds, we heard the two guys in tent number 2 yell back that they were awake and asked what was going on. There was still nothing from the guy who was sleeping in the solo tent. We grabbed our rifles and stepped out into the rain. It had only been maybe a minute since we first woke up, but it felt longer. Mud was already forming around the tents. We called out to the solo guy by name. A few seconds passed. Then he yelled back, "Sorry, I'm good. I punched a bear." We all froze for a second, not sure if we heard him right. Once he came out of his tent, we saw his hand. It was bleeding pretty good. He said he'd been asleep when the side of his tent pushed in and touched his head. He half woke up and shoved it back, thinking it was wind. Then it pushed harder, and that's when he punched it. The tent lines were ripped out of the ground, and there were claw marks in the mud leading away, and clear bear tracks sinking deep into the wet soil. It was probably a young, curious black bear, but nonetheless, none of us slept the rest of that night.
Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The pounding started around 9:30 that Saturday night in October 2018, right when I was getting ready to watch a movie alone in my apartment. I was 28 then, had just moved to Denver 6 months earlier for a marketing job, and was living in this old brick building from the 60s with paper-thin walls and creaky floors. My place was on the 3rd floor, Unit 3B, sandwiched between 2 other apartments that usually stayed pretty quiet, except for the occasional TV noise or footsteps. I remember I just made myself some popcorn and was settling into my couch when the banging erupted from 3C next door. Not knocking, but desperate, rhythmic pounding that made my entire wall vibrate. Between the impacts, I could hear a man's voice, muffled but urgent, saying my name over and over. "Jessica, Jessica, please come quick." I knew the voice belonged to my neighbor Grant, this guy in his 40s who'd lived there for years and mostly kept to himself, except for the polite nods we'd exchange in the hallway. The pounding got more intense, and then I heard him clearly through the wall. "Jessica, someone's hurt bad. Please, I need help. Open your door." My first instinct was to grab my phone and call 911, but something about the raw panic in his voice made me jump up and rush to my door. I pressed my ear against it, trying to hear better, and Grant's voice came again, closer now, like he was right outside in the hallway. "Jessica, please, she's bleeding. I don't know what to do. Just come to my door, hurry." I grabbed my keys and phone, my heart hammering against my ribs, and slowly turned the deadbolt. The hallway was dimmer than usual. One of the overhead bulbs had burned out earlier that week, and the landlord hadn't fixed it yet, leaving these long shadows stretching across the worn burgundy carpet. Grant's door was maybe 15 feet from mine, and I could see it was cracked open about 6 inches, just darkness visible through the gap. "Grant," I called out, taking a step into the hallway, and his voice came immediately from inside his apartment. "In here, quick, please." But something made me pause right there in my doorway. Maybe it was how his voice sounded exactly the same as before, like a recording being played back with that same inflection on the word, "please." I gripped my phone tighter, already pulling up the dial pad for 911, when I noticed something that made every muscle in my body tense up. There were no sounds coming from inside his apartment except his voice. No crying, no movement, nothing that suggested someone injured. That's when I caught movement in my peripheral vision, down at the far end of the hallway near the stairwell, and I turned my head just enough to see Mr. Brennan from 3A, the unit on the other side of mine, standing there in the shadows. He was this skinny older man, maybe 60-something, with these thick glasses and a habit of wearing the same gray cardigan every day, and he was just standing there, not moving toward his door or the stairs, just watching me. The strange thing was, he had his hands behind his back and was rocking slightly on his heels, like he was waiting for something, and when our eyes met, he gave me this little nod and started walking toward me, not rushing, just taking these measured, deliberate steps down the hallway. "Everything all right, Jessica?" he asked in this soft, almost sing-song voice that I'd never heard him use before in the 2 years we'd been neighbors. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get back inside my apartment, but I was caught between Grant's door still calling my name. "Jessica, she's dying, please," and Mr. Brennan closing the distance between us with those steady, purposeful steps. I pressed 911 on my phone but kept it at my side, not raising it to my ear yet, trying to look calm while my mind raced through what was happening. "Grant needs help," I said to Mr. Brennan, taking a small step backward toward my door, testing his reaction. Someone's hurt in there. His face did this weird thing where he smiled but only with his mouth, his eyes staying completely flat behind those thick lenses, and he said, "Oh yes, I heard all that noise too. Terrible thing. Why don't you go help him? I'll make sure nobody disturbs you." The way he emphasized "nobody disturbs you" made my throat go dry, and I noticed his hands were still hidden behind his back, his knuckles making small movements like he was gripping something. Grant's voice came again from his apartment, louder this time, more desperate. "Jessica, I can't stop the bleeding, please." But here's what really made me realize I was in danger. His voice was coming from the exact same spot as before, hadn't moved an inch within the apartment, and when I glanced at his cracked door, I could see through the gap that his living room light was off, but there was this faint blue glow, like from a phone screen held low. Mr. Brennan was now only about 10 feet away, still approaching with that empty smile, and he tilted his head slightly and said, "Grant really does need you in there, Jessica. He's been talking about you for weeks, you know. Says you're perfect." My thumb found the call button on my phone, and I started backing up faster toward my door. But then Grant's door suddenly swung open wider, and I saw a hand grip the door frame from inside. Not Grant's hand, because Grant has these small, soft hands I'd noticed when he'd helped me carry groceries once. But this hand was huge, with thick fingers and dirt under the nails, wearing what looked like a latex glove. I hit the call button and spun around, launching myself toward my apartment door. But Mr. Brennan moved faster than I expected for his age, lunging forward and grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. Now, Jessica, that's very rude when your neighbor needs help," he hissed, his breath smelling like cigarettes and something medicinal, and I could feel his other hand coming around from behind his back. I yanked my arm hard and screamed, not a scared whimper but a full-throated primal scream that echoed down the hallway, while the 911 operator's voice came tiny and distant from my phone. 911, what's your emergency?" Mr. Brennan's grip loosened for just a second, probably not expecting me to be so loud, and I jerked free, stumbling toward my door while screaming the address into the phone. Behind me I heard heavy footsteps emerging from Grant's apartment, multiple sets of feet, and Grant's real voice, not the recorded one, saying something angry and frustrated that I couldn't make out. I crashed into my door, scrambling with the keys while looking back to see 3 figures now in the hallway. Mr. Brennan, a massive man I'd never seen before wearing work coveralls and those latex gloves, and Grant himself, who looked nothing like the nervous, fidgety neighbor I knew. His face was calm, focused, and he was holding what looked like a roll of duct tape in one hand and zip ties in the other. The 911 operator was asking questions, but I just kept screaming my address and 3 men trying to break in over and over while jamming my key into the lock. The big man in coveralls started moving toward me, not running but walking with this terrible confidence like he knew he could catch me, and Mr. Brennan was saying something to Grant about the other doors, which made me realize they might have keys. They might have been planning this for who knows how long, studying my schedule, waiting for a Saturday night when the building was quietest. My key finally turned and I threw myself inside, slamming the door and turning the deadbolt, just as bodies crashed against it from the other side. The door shook in its frame, and I heard Mr. Brennan's voice, calm and instructional. "Grant, you said the landlord gave you the master key last month." My entire body went cold as I heard metal scraping against the lock, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my kitchen chair and wedged it under the door handle, then ran to my bedroom window that faced the street. The 911 operator was still on the line, now saying units were on the way, 2 minutes out, but I could hear my deadbolt starting to turn. I yanked open the window and started screaming into the night. "Help! Someone help me! They're breaking in! Call 911!" A couple walking their dog looked up, confused at first. Then the woman pulled out her phone when she saw my panic. The deadbolt clicked open, but the chair held for a moment, the door jamming against it as they pushed from the outside. I ran to my kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find, still screaming, making as much noise as possible. And that's when I heard the beautiful sound of sirens in the distance. The pushing against my door stopped abruptly, and I heard quick footsteps in the hallway, Grant's voice saying, "Go, go, go," and then doors slamming. Through my peephole, I could see the hallway was empty, but I didn't move that chair or open that door until I saw the police officers' uniforms through the peephole 5 minutes later. When I finally let them in, I was shaking so badly I could barely stand, and one officer had to help me to my couch while I explained everything that had happened. The fake emergency, the coordinated trap, how they'd clearly been planning to take me into Grant's apartment for God knows what purpose. The police found Grant's apartment exactly as I'd described. His phone was still on the coffee table with a voice recording app open, showing multiple saved files with my name in them, recordings of him saying different emergency scenarios. In Mr. Brennan's apartment, they found a notebook with detailed notes about all the female residents in the building, our schedules, when we had visitors, when we were alone, which ones had boyfriends, which ones didn't. My page had stars next to it, and a note that said 3rd floor, minimal foot traffic Saturdays. The big man in coveralls had vanished, but they found out from the landlord that Grant had indeed convinced him to give him a master key, claiming he needed it to help elderly residents when the landlord was unavailable. They arrested Grant and Mr. Brennan that night. Grant tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, that he really did have someone injured in his apartment, but the complete absence of any blood or injured person, plus the recording equipment and Brennan's stalking notebook, told a different story. I moved out 3 days later, stayed with a friend while I found a new place, and I still check every lock twice before I sleep. The district attorney told me they'd both taken plea deals to avoid trial. Grant got 8 years for attempted kidnapping and conspiracy. Brennan got 6 years. They never found the third man, which honestly still keeps me up some nights, wondering if he's out there somewhere. Maybe in another building, maybe trying the same thing with some other woman who lives alone. The detective on the case told me I probably saved my own life by making so much noise and calling 911 immediately, instead of going to help. Said they'd seen similar cases where women disappeared after being lured by fake emergencies. I share this story whenever I can, especially to other women living alone, because that helpful instinct, that desire to assist a neighbor in crisis, is exactly what predators like them count on. And sometimes the best thing you can do is trust that uncomfortable feeling and make that call instead of opening your door. Last year around this time, everything in my life went from normal to absolutely terrifying in a matter of weeks, and it all started with me asking my neighbor to turn down his music. At 34, raising my 8-year-old daughter Chloe by myself in Columbus, Ohio wasn't always easy, but we'd found our rhythm in this modest apartment complex off Hamilton Road. My job as a dental hygienist kept us comfortable enough. Not rich by any means, but we could afford our 2-bedroom ground floor unit and still have money left over for Chloe's dance classes every Saturday. After my divorce 2 years earlier, This place felt like our sanctuary, a fresh start where nobody knew our business and we could just be ourselves. Building C, apartment 12, had become our little haven, surrounded by mostly older residents and young families who smiled politely in passing, but minded their own business. We'd been there 8 months without a single issue, which made what happened next even more shocking. Everything changed when Dustin moved into apartment 14 right next door to us in early September. 22 years old, according to the maintenance guy who loved to gossip, Dustin looked exactly like you'd expect a kid fresh out of college to look, skinny as a rail, patchy facial hair that desperately wanted to be a beard, always wearing these ratty band shirts for groups I'd never heard of. His parents must have been helping with rent because there was no way someone his age could afford this place on their own, not with the fancy gaming setup I saw him hauling in through his door. For about a week, things were fine. I'd see him checking his mail or heading out with a backpack slung over one shoulder, and we'd exchange those awkward neighbor nods. But then came the music, and holy hell, this wasn't just someone playing their stereo a bit too loud. Every night starting at 11 on the dot, right when Chloe and I were settling into bed, these pounding bass lines would shake our entire apartment like we lived next door to a nightclub. After 2 weeks of this torture, with Chloe falling asleep in class and me messing up at work from pure exhaustion, I finally worked up the courage to knock on his door. It was a Saturday afternoon, around 2 o'clock, and I could hear him moving around in there playing video games. Lots of shooting sounds and him yelling at someone through a headset. I knocked 3 times before he answered, and when he finally opened the door, he only cracked it about 6 inches, peering at me through the gap like I was trying to sell him something. His apartment reeked of weed and energy drinks, and I could see empty pizza boxes stacked on every surface behind him. I put on my friendliest smile, introduced myself properly as his neighbor from apartment 12, and explained as politely as possible that the late-night music was keeping my daughter awake on school nights. I even made sure to say please, mentioned that I understood he was young and probably didn't realize how thin these walls were, and asked if he could maybe use headphones after 10 p.m. His reaction should have been my first warning sign that something was seriously wrong with this kid. Instead of apologizing or even acknowledging what I'd said, he just stared at me for this long, uncomfortable moment, his eyes moving slowly from my face down to my feet and back up again. Not in a checking me out way, but more like he was memorizing every detail about me, filing it away for later. When he finally spoke, his voice was this weird monotone, completely flat. Nobody else has complained. That was it. No sorry. No acknowledgement that maybe blasting music at 2 a.m. might disturb people. Just that one sentence delivered like a robot. I tried again, keeping my voice light and friendly, explaining that my daughter was only 8 and really needed her sleep for school. He tilted his head slightly like a confused dog and said, "Sounds like a you problem, not a me problem." Then he shut the door in my face. Not slammed it, just calmly, slowly closed it while maintaining eye contact through the shrinking gap until it clicked shut. That night the music was louder than ever, and I swear he'd moved his speakers right up against our shared wall. But it wasn't just regular music anymore. He was playing the same song on repeat for hours, this heavy metal track with someone screaming about violence and revenge. Chloe was in tears, covering her ears with her pillow, and I finally had enough. I called the apartment complex's after-hours line and filed a noise complaint, giving them all the details about my attempt to resolve it directly with him first. The security guy who answered said he'd send someone over to talk to Dustin. And sure enough, about 30 minutes later the music stopped completely. I thought that would be the end of it, that maybe getting talked to by management would make him realize he couldn't act like he owned the place. Chloe finally fell asleep around midnight, and I remember lying in my bed feeling relieved that I'd stood up for us, that things would go back to normal now. Monday morning, I opened my door to take Chloe to school and found our welcome mat covered in what looked like dog crap, smeared deep into the fibers with a stick or something. The smell hit us immediately, and Chloe started gagging while I tried to shield her from seeing it properly. But here's the thing. Nobody in our building had dogs. It was against the lease agreement, which meant someone had deliberately brought this here and rubbed it into our mat. I had to throw the whole thing in the dumpster and scrub our doorstep with bleach while Chloe waited in the car, making us 20 minutes late. When I got home from work that evening, I found a note tucked into our door frame, printed in block letters. "Karma's a bitch." No signature, of course, but I knew exactly who it was from. I kept the note, took pictures of everything, and emailed the apartment management company. But their response was basically that without proof it was him, they couldn't do anything except keep an eye on the situation. Within a week, things escalated in ways I never could have imagined. First, I started hearing rumors from other neighbors. Apparently, Dustin had been telling people I was a prostitute who brought men home while my daughter was sleeping. Mrs. Garrett from apartment 16, this sweet elderly lady who used to babysit Chloe sometimes, actually pulled me aside near the mailboxes to ask if I was in some kind of trouble and needed help. When I asked what she meant, she got all flustered and said Dustin had warned her to be careful around me because I was involved in dangerous activities and had questionable men coming and going at all hours. I was mortified. This 70-year-old woman who'd baked cookies for Chloe was now looking at me like I might be running some kind of escort service out of my living room. I tried explaining what was really happening, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. The seed of doubt had been planted, and Dustin knew exactly what he was doing by targeting the building gossip. Then came the packages. Every few days, I'd get these deliveries I never ordered. Adult toys from websites I'd never even heard of, all addressed to me with my full name but paid for with prepaid cards so they couldn't be traced. The delivery guys would smirk or avoid eye contact when I answered the door, and I knew they could see what company names were on the boxes. One afternoon, Chloe answered the door before I could stop her and asked me why someone sent us a package from Lover's Paradise. Try explaining that to an 8-year-old. I started refusing deliveries, but then they'd just get left on our doorstep for everyone to see. The worst part was when these catalogs started arriving in my mailbox. Hardcore adult material mixed in with my regular mail, stuff so explicit that I had to grab the mail before Chloe could see it. All of it was addressed to me personally, like I'd signed up for subscriptions. I was basically being slut-shamed by a kid who probably hadn't even had a real girlfriend yet. Everything came to a head on a Friday evening in early November. Chloe was at her dad's for the weekend, which was the only reason I hadn't completely lost it yet. At least she was getting breaks from this nightmare every other week. I'd just gotten home from work, exhausted and dreading what new hell might be waiting for me, when I noticed my living room curtains looked weird from outside. Getting closer, I realized they were slightly parted, which was strange because I always kept them perfectly closed now, paranoid about giving Dustin any view into our apartment. As I walked up to fix them, something moved in the gap, a quick flash of light being pulled back. My chest got tight as I carefully approached the window from the side, staying out of direct view, and peeked through a tiny corner of the curtain. There was Dustin, standing at his window with his phone raised, recording through the 3-inch gap in my curtains. He was so focused on trying to see inside my apartment that he didn't notice me watching him watch me. I banged on the window hard enough to rattle the frame, and I'll never forget the expression on his face when he realized he'd been caught. Instead of looking embarrassed or scared, he smiled, this slow, deliberate grin that made my stomach turn to ice. He kept his phone pointed at me and actually waved with his free hand, mouthing words I couldn't make out through the glass. I yanked my curtains completely closed and immediately called 911, but by the time the cops showed up 15 minutes later, Dustin was back inside his apartment, claiming he'd been gaming all evening and had no idea what I was talking about. The officers took my statement but said that without the actual footage or him still being at the window, it was just my word against his. One of them, this younger cop who seemed genuinely concerned, suggested I look into getting security cameras and maybe staying somewhere else for a while if I felt unsafe. But where was I supposed to go? This was our home, and I couldn't afford to just pick up and move. That night changed everything for me. I decided I was done being a victim and started planning my counterattack. First thing Saturday morning, I drove to Best Buy and maxed out my credit card on security equipment. 4 cameras that could record in night vision, motion sensor lights for our doorway, and this doorbell camera that sent alerts straight to my phone. I spent the entire day installing everything myself, YouTube tutorials playing on repeat while I drilled holes and ran cables. I also did something else. I started documenting everything obsessively. Every weird noise, every time I saw him watching me, every piece of trash that mysteriously appeared on our doorstep went into a notebook with dates, times, and photos. I created a Gmail account just for evidence, forwarding myself everything so there'd be timestamps. Within 3 days, I had him on camera twice, once leaving another disgusting gift on our doormat at 3 a.m., and once standing outside our window for 20 minutes just staring at our apartment. The footage was crystal clear, his face perfectly visible in the infrared light. Armed with all this evidence, I marched into the property management office and demanded to speak with the regional manager, not the useless site supervisor who'd been ignoring me. I laid out everything: the videos, the photos, the notebook, printed emails showing my previous complaints, even testimonies from 2 neighbors who'd witnessed him lurking around our door. I told them either they evicted him or I'd be calling a lawyer about their failure to provide a safe living environment for my child, and I'd make sure every potential tenant knew about it on every review site that existed. Apparently, that did the trick because within a week, Dustin received an eviction notice for lease violations, including harassment of other tenants and creating a disturbance. He had 30 days to get out, and during that time, there was a cop car parked in our complex lot. Almost every night after I'd explained the situation to them, Dustin moved out on day 29, loading his stuff into a U-Haul while shooting me dirty looks from across the parking lot. The new neighbor who moved in is a quiet nursing student who bakes brownies for everyone on the floor. I still have those cameras up though, and I check them every single night before bed. Some habits are hard to break when someone made you feel that unsafe in your own home. Most people think neighborly disputes are just minor annoyances that work themselves out eventually. I used to believe that too, until last spring when everything spiraled completely out of control with the guy living next door. I was 34 at the time, had just gotten promoted to regional manager at a logistics company, and my wife Natalie and I were settling into our first real house in a quiet suburb outside Portland. We'd moved in about 6 months earlier, right after Christmas, and everything seemed perfect. Good schools for when we decided to have kids, a decent-sized backyard, and what we thought were friendly neighbors. The previous owners had warned us that the guy next door, Frank Garrison, could be particular about property lines, but we figured that just meant he liked to keep his lawn neat. If only we'd known what that really meant, maybe we could have handled things differently from the start. The whole nightmare began on a Saturday morning in early May, when I needed to leave for an important golf meeting with potential clients. I grabbed my coffee, kissed Natalie goodbye, and headed to the garage only to find a massive Ford F-350 blocking my entire driveway. Not partially blocking it, the truck was parked completely perpendicular across the entrance, like someone had deliberately positioned it to make it impossible for anyone to get in or out. Frank was standing in his front yard, casually watering his petunias like nothing was wrong, wearing those same faded overalls he wore every weekend. When I walked over and politely asked him to move his truck, he just kept watering, didn't even glance in my direction. I explained that I had an important meeting and really needed to leave, trying to keep my voice friendly and reasonable. That's when he finally turned to face me, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes, completely blank, like he was staring through me at something only he could see. He set down his hose real slow, walked right up to me until our faces were maybe 6 inches apart, and said in this eerily calm voice, "Your wife parked 2 inches over my property line last week. 2 inches. This is what happens when people don't respect boundaries." I tried to de-escalate, apologizing for the parking issue even though I had no idea what he was talking about. and asked him again to please move his truck. But Frank just stood there, breathing heavily through his nose, his breath smelling like stale cigarettes and something medicinal, maybe cough syrup. After what felt like an eternity, he walked to his truck, started it up, and moved it about 3 feet, still blocking most of my driveway but technically leaving just enough space for me to squeeze out if I drove over part of my lawn. When I protested that this wasn't really moving it, he turned around and started screaming at the top of his lungs, his face turning this deep purple color, veins bulging in his neck. "You people think you own the whole goddamn neighborhood. First the property line, now you're telling me where I can park on a public street?" The transformation was instant and terrifying, from dead calm to explosive rage in seconds. Several neighbors came out to see what was happening, including Mrs. Jeffries from across the street, but nobody intervened. They all just watched from their porches, and I noticed how they avoided making eye contact with Frank, like they knew something I didn't. That afternoon, after I got home from my meeting, which went terribly because I arrived 40 minutes late and flustered, things got worse. Every time Frank saw me through a window or in the yard, he'd start shouting obscenities, calling me names I won't repeat here, accusing me of trying to steal his land, of conspiring with the city to change property lines, completely unhinged stuff that made no sense. Natalie wanted to call the police, but I convinced her to wait, thinking maybe he was having a bad day or dealing with some personal issues and would calm down by tomorrow. Around dinner time, we heard this rhythmic banging on our fence. Frank was out there with a hammer, not exactly hitting the fence, but tapping it repeatedly, walking the entire length of our shared boundary, tap, 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 over and over. When I went outside to ask what he was doing, he said he was checking for weak spots, and that good fences make good neighbors, but weak fences invite trespassers. The way he emphasized trespassers while staring directly at me made it clear this was a threat, not maintenance. The real terror started that night around 2 a.m. when we woke up to pounding on our front door. Not knocking, but full force pounding like someone trying to break it down. Natalie grabbed my arm so tight her nails dug into my skin as we lay there in bed, both of us too scared to move at first. The pounding went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped, then started again, this time accompanied by Frank's voice shouting about his property, about respect, about how we needed to learn our place. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the closet and crept downstairs, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Through the peephole, I could see Frank standing there in just his boxers and a tank top, his fist raised to pound again, his face contorted with rage, even though his eyes looked almost vacant, like he wasn't completely there. When I shouted through the door that I was calling 911, he stopped mid-swing, lowered his fist slowly, and walked backward off our porch, never turning around, just walking backward all the way to his house while maintaining eye contact with our door. The whole thing was so bizarre and unsettling that even after he went inside, Natalie and I sat in our living room with all the lights on until sunrise, too anxious to go back to sleep. The next morning, a Sunday, we found dozens of nails scattered across our driveway, not randomly dropped, but carefully placed pointing upward, positioned right where our tires would hit them when backing out. I spent an hour picking them all up while Frank sat on his porch in a lawn chair, drinking beer at 8 a.m., and watching me with this satisfied expression. When Natalie came out to help me, he started making these crude comments about her appearance, loud enough for us to hear but not quite yelling, describing what she was wearing and making suggestions about what she should wear instead. That was my breaking point. I marched over to confront him, but before I could say anything, he stood up and pulled out his phone, claiming he was recording me for evidence of harassment. He kept backing away while filming, narrating to his phone that I was aggressively approaching him on his property, even though I hadn't even left my driveway yet. Then he started calling out to invisible witnesses, yelling, "Someone help! This man is threatening me!" Even though the street was empty and I hadn't said a single word. We finally called the police that afternoon, and 2 officers showed up about an hour later. But here's where things got even more frustrating. Frank transformed completely when they arrived. He put on this whole performance, speaking softly and respectfully, showing them documentation about property lines he'd apparently been collecting for months, even producing a surveyor's report from 2016 that showed our fence was allegedly 3 inches over his property line. He had photos on his phone that he claimed showed our repeated violations, though when I looked at them later during the report, they were just pictures of our car parked normally in our own driveway, Natalie gardening in our own yard, and me mowing our own lawn. The officers seemed tired and uninterested, telling us it was a civil matter, that neighbors needed to work these things out between themselves. Frank stood behind them the whole time with this smug smile, nodding along like a concerned citizen just trying to protect his property rights. After they left, he walked to our shared fence and whispered through the slats, "They never help. They never do anything. It's just you and me now." That evening, things took an even darker turn when Natalie's sister Amy came over for dinner with her 2 kids. Frank must have been watching because the moment their car pulled up, he came outside and started his routine. First the shouting about property lines, then escalating to personal attacks. But when he saw the kids, 8-year-old twins, getting out of the car, something shifted in his demeanor. He walked right up to our property line and started talking directly to them, ignoring Amy's attempts to shield them, telling them their aunt and uncle were bad people who steal from their neighbors, asking them if they knew what happened to thieves, if they'd ever seen someone get punished for stealing. The kids were terrified, clinging to their mother as she rushed them inside. Frank followed along his side of the property line, continuing his monologue about punishment and justice, his voice getting louder and more agitated. When Amy's husband Brian arrived later and confronted Frank about scaring the children, Frank just laughed and said kids needed to learn about consequences early, that it was actually good parenting to expose them to real-world situations. Monday morning brought a new horror when I discovered Frank had called my workplace. My boss pulled me aside first thing and asked if everything was okay at home, saying a concerned neighbor had called claiming I was having violent episodes, that he'd heard screaming and breaking glass from our house at all hours. Frank had given them his full name and contact information, presenting himself as a worried citizen, even suggesting they might want to check if I was fit for a management position given my apparent instability at home. I had to spend 2 hours in HR explaining the situation, showing them the police report we'd filed, and even then I could tell they were looking at me differently. When I got home that evening, Frank was pressure washing his driveway, and as soon as he saw me, he turned the spray toward our property line, not quite hitting our house but sending a fine mist over our front windows. He kept this up for 3 hours straight, the constant drone of the machine making it impossible to hear our TV or have a conversation. Every time we looked outside, he'd wave cheerfully like we were best friends, then redirect the spray a little closer to our property. The breaking point came on Wednesday night when Frank showed up at our back door. Not the front door this time, but actually in our backyard, his face pressed against our kitchen window while we were eating dinner. Natalie screamed and dropped her plate, and I immediately ran for my phone to call 911. But Frank started talking through the glass, his breath fogging it up, saying he'd seen someone suspicious in our backyard and just wanted to make sure we were safe. He claimed the gate was open. It wasn't. I always kept it locked, and he was just being a good neighbor checking on us. By the time the police arrived 20 minutes later, Frank was back on his property, calmly explaining to the officers that he'd seen what looked like a prowler and was just trying to help. He even showed them a flashlight and said he'd called out several times before entering our yard, which was a complete lie. The officers gave him a warning about trespassing but seemed to buy his Good Samaritan act, especially when he mentioned his concern about rising crime in the neighborhood and produced a printed article about a break-in that happened 6 miles away 3 months ago. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands and started documenting everything myself. I installed security cameras covering every angle of our property, bought a video doorbell, and started keeping a detailed log of every incident with dates and times. Natalie thought I was becoming obsessed, and maybe I was, but I needed evidence that couldn't be disputed. The very next day, I caught Frank on camera at 3 a.m. using a slingshot to shoot small rocks at our bedroom window. Not hard enough to break it, but just enough to make a tapping sound that would wake us up. When I reviewed the footage, I could see him doing this methodically, shooting once every few minutes for almost an hour, then walking back to his house like nothing happened. I also caught him on camera opening our mailbox and rifling through our mail, though he never took anything, just looked at each piece and put it back. Armed with this evidence, I went to the police station in person and insisted on filing charges. The desk sergeant watched the videos, took my statement, and actually seemed to take it seriously this time. They sent a detective to talk to Frank that afternoon, and for a brief moment, I thought we might finally get some peace. But Frank must have realized I had cameras now because his tactics changed. Instead of direct harassment, he started doing things just barely within legal limits, mowing his lawn at 6 a.m. every single day, right along our bedroom wall, playing talk radio at maximum volume in his garage with the door open facing our house, burning trash in his backyard fire pit whenever we had our windows open, creating the most noxious smoke that would fill our house. Then came the grand finale last Friday. I woke up to find my car covered in what looked like honey or syrup, completely coated from hood to trunk, with birdseed scattered all over it. By the time I discovered it, there were hundreds of birds swarming my car, pecking at it, leaving scratches all over the paint. But here's the thing, the cameras showed nothing. Somehow Frank had found their blind spots, or maybe he'd hired someone else to do it, I don't know. When I confronted him, he just shrugged and suggested maybe I should park in my garage instead of the driveway, then added with a smile that nature can be unpredictable sometimes. That weekend I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. Cost me $2,000, but within 3 days he found out what nobody in the neighborhood would tell me directly. Frank had done this before, twice. Once in Phoenix 8 years ago, where he'd harassed a family so relentlessly they broke their lease and fled in the middle of the night, and once in Eugene where he'd been arrested for stalking but got off on a technicality because the victims had moved away and wouldn't return to testify. The investigator also discovered Frank was on disability for a workplace head injury from 2015, which might explain the erratic behavior, but didn't excuse it. Armed with this information and a thick folder of documentation, I went to a lawyer who specialized in harassment cases. She took one look at everything and said we had enough for both a restraining order and a civil suit. The court date was set for the following Monday, and Frank was served papers that Saturday morning. I watched from my window as the process server handed him the documents, and for the first time since this all started, I saw genuine surprise on his face. He stood in his doorway reading them for a full 10 minutes, his expression shifting from confusion to what looked like panic. Sunday was eerily quiet. No lawn mowing, no loud music, no harassment at all. Frank's truck never left his driveway, and his blinds stayed closed all day. Monday morning at the courthouse, Frank showed up looking disheveled, representing himself, trying to argue that this was all a misunderstanding between neighbors. But when the judge saw the videos, read the police reports, and heard about his history in other states, she granted the restraining order immediately. Frank had to stay 100 feet away from us and our property, which meant he couldn't even use his own backyard or the side of his house facing ours. The judge gave him 30 days to find alternative living arrangements. As we left the courthouse, Frank didn't say a word, didn't even look at us, just stood there staring at the ground. Within 2 weeks, a for sale sign went up in his yard, and by the end of the month, he was gone. The new neighbors, a retired couple named the Washburns, are lovely people who brought us cookies the day they moved in and always wave when they see us. Sometimes I still check the cameras at night, though, and Natalie says I get tense whenever I hear unexpected noises outside. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't in horror movies. They're living right next door, hiding behind property lines and false politeness, waiting for the smallest excuse to make your life hell. I was hunched over my laptop trying to finish a logo design when the ceiling started shaking so hard that my coffee mug walked itself right off the desk. 7 a.m. on a Saturday in Milwaukee, and my upstairs neighbor Calvin had decided to blast dubstep at concert volume. I'm 28, been doing freelance graphic design for my one-bedroom apartment for about 2 years now, and up until that day, my biggest problems were usually just meeting client deadlines or remembering to eat something besides cereal for dinner. 6 months earlier, I'd signed the lease on this place in a converted 1940s warehouse, all exposed brick and creaky hardwood floors, radiators that sounded like medieval torture devices when the heat kicked on. The landlord had promised a quiet, professional community, and for the most part, he'd been right. People here minded their own business, which worked perfectly for someone who spent most days in pajama pants, cycling between my desk and the coffee maker. Calvin had moved in about 2 months after me, taking the unit directly above mine. Mid-30s guy with this patchy beard that looked like he'd lost interest halfway through growing it, always wearing these faded band shirts with mysterious stains and holes in weird places. We'd only had 2 interactions before that Saturday. Once when a package of his got delivered to my door, some kind of audio equipment from the return label, and another time in the basement laundry room where he just stood there watching me load my washer, not responding when I tried to make conversation about the perpetually broken dryer. The music had been going since I woke up, but by 10 a.m. it had gotten so loud that my ceiling fan was visibly wobbling, and I could feel each bass drop in my ribcage like a second heartbeat. My client's logo was due Monday morning, and I couldn't string 2 thoughts together with what sounded like an underground rave happening 8 feet above my head. I'd been putting off going upstairs for hours, hoping he'd eventually turn it down on his own or leave for work or something. But by noon, after I'd accidentally typed "Make it stop" in 72-point font on my client's logo, I knew I had to do something. I practiced what I'd say in my head while climbing the stairs. Keep it friendly, maybe mention the thin floors, suggest some compromise about quiet hours. The hallway on the 3rd floor always smelled weird, like wet cardboard mixed with something chemical, and Calvin's door had these deep scratches near the bottom that I'd never noticed before. When I knocked, the music cut off instantly, like he'd been standing right there waiting. The sudden silence made my ears ring. Through the door I could hear breathing, heavy and deliberate, but he didn't open it for what felt like a full minute. When he finally did, just a crack with the chain still on, one bloodshot eye peered out at me, and I noticed his apartment behind him was completely dark, except for the glow of multiple computer monitors. "Hey Calvin," I started, trying to keep my voice steady and pleasant. "I'm really sorry to bother you, but the music is pretty loud and I'm trying to work on a project. Would you mind turning it down just a bit?" His visible eye didn't blink once while I talked, just stayed locked on my face like he was memorizing every detail. His breathing got heavier, and I could smell something sour wafting out from his apartment, like spoiled milk mixed with sweat. "You trying to tell me what to do in my own home?" he finally said, his voice raspier than I remembered, like he'd been screaming or hadn't spoken in days. No, I'm just asking if you could maybe..." But he slammed the door so hard that one of his neighbors, Mrs. Nguyen, poked her head out to see what was happening. She gave me this sympathetic look and quickly retreated back inside. As I stood there, still processing what just happened, the music started again, somehow even louder than before, and I heard him laughing through the door. Not a normal laugh, but this hollow, rhythmic sound that went on way too long. The rest of Saturday was hell. Every time I'd start to concentrate, he'd drop something heavy right above wherever I was sitting, like he was tracking my movements through the floor. Around 3 p.m., I tried calling the landlord, Mr. Reeves, but got his voicemail. He was probably at his cabin up north like he was every weekend. I left a message trying to sound calm and reasonable, explaining the situation, but I could hear my voice getting higher and tighter as I talked. Then things got weirder. Calvin started stomping in patterns. 3 heavy steps, pause, 3 more steps, pause, for 20 minutes straight. When that stopped, He began dragging furniture across his floor, back and forth, the scraping sound like nails on a chalkboard. I tried putting on my noise-canceling headphones, but somehow the vibrations still came through, rattling up through my chair and into my spine. By evening, I gave up on work and ordered Thai food, figuring I'd just try to relax and deal with it tomorrow. The delivery driver, this young kid with braces, looked nervous when he got to my door. "That your boyfriend upstairs?" he asked while I signed the receipt. "What? No, why?" I said, and he shifted uncomfortably. Dude was standing in his window when I pulled up, just staring down at the street. Soon as he saw me coming to your door, he started hitting the glass with something. Made me jump. The kid practically ran back to his car, and when I looked up at Calvin's window, the blind snapped shut. I went inside and tried to eat my pad thai, but my appetite was gone. Around 9 p.m., the music finally stopped, replaced by something worse. Calvin talking to himself upstairs, his voice rising and falling like he was having an argument with someone who wasn't there. I could make out fragments through the ceiling. "Thinks she can control me. Showed her. Not gonna take it." Then I heard my name, clear as day, followed by a string of words that made my whole body go rigid with fear. Sunday morning came with a new form of harassment. At 5 a.m., Calvin started playing audio through his speakers. A recording of my phone conversation with Mr. Reeves from yesterday, but slowed down and distorted so my voice sounded demonic. He had somehow recorded me through the floor or walls. He played it on loop for an hour straight while I lay in bed, paralyzed with the realization that he'd been listening to everything I did. When I finally got up and went to make coffee, I found a note that had been slid under my door during the night. It was written in red marker on a piece of notebook paper torn raggedly from a spiral binding. "Noise complaint filed against you. 2 can play this game." My apartment's doorknob had some kind of greasy substance smeared on it that I hadn't noticed when I'd grabbed it earlier. I washed my hands 3 times, feeling sick. The walls started to feel too close, the air too thick. I called my sister in Madison, begging to stay with her for a few days, but she was out of town until Wednesday for work. By Sunday afternoon, Calvin had escalated to following my footsteps from above, staying directly over me wherever I moved in my apartment. Kitchen to bathroom, bathroom to bedroom, bedroom to living room. His heavy steps shadowed mine perfectly. When I sat still, he would stand right above me and bounce on his heels, making the ceiling creak rhythmically. I tried leaving to get some air and maybe work from a coffee shop, but when I opened my door, Calvin was standing at the top of the stairs, just out of sight around the corner. I could see his shadow and hear his breathing. "Going somewhere?" he called down in that raspy voice, and I heard him take one step down, then another. I slammed my door shut and locked it, adding the chain for good measure. Through the peephole, I watched his distorted figure come down and stand directly in front of my door for 5 entire minutes. Not moving, not speaking, just breathing loud enough for me to hear. Mrs. Nguyen's door opened briefly, then immediately closed again with the sound of multiple locks engaging. That Sunday night was when Calvin completely lost it. Around 11 p.m., just as I was trying to convince myself to get some sleep, he started slamming something heavy against his floor, my ceiling, with methodical precision. Boom, 10 seconds, boom, 10 seconds, boom. Dust and small pieces of plaster began falling onto my bed. Then came his voice through the air vents, crystal clear like he was speaking directly into them. "You ruined everything. You couldn't just mind your own business. Now you'll learn what happens when you disrespect me." The slamming stopped, replaced by the sound of him screaming. Not words, just pure, animalistic rage that went on for so long I thought his throat would give out. Other neighbors must have heard it too, because I could hear doors opening and closing in the hallway, muffled voices discussing whether to call someone. But nobody did. We all just waited in our separate boxes, hoping it would stop. At 2 a.m., the pounding started on my door. Not knocking, pounding with what sounded like both fists, maybe even kicking. The whole frame shook, and I could see the chain lock straining with each impact. "Open the door! I know you're in there! We need to talk about respect." Calvin's voice was completely unhinged now, hoarse from screaming but still going. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering to the dispatcher while huddled in my bathroom with the door locked. The pounding got harder, and I heard wood splintering. Through all the noise, I could hear Mrs. Nguyen's voice in the hallway. "I'm calling the police, you need to stop." Calvin responded by turning his rage on her, and I heard her door slam shut. The 911 dispatcher stayed on the line with me, saying units were 3 minutes away. But those were the longest 3 minutes of my life. The pounding reached a fever pitch, and I was certain the door would give way any second. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and stood behind my couch, shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The sirens arrived just as I heard the first crack of wood giving way near my door's deadbolt. Calvin must have heard them too, because the pounding suddenly stopped, followed by the sound of his heavy footsteps running up the stairs. The police, 2 officers, knocked and identified themselves, and I nearly collapsed with relief when I opened what was left of my door. The frame was destroyed, with deep dents and gouges in the wood, splinters all over my hallway floor. They took my statement while 2 other officers went upstairs to Calvin's unit. I could hear them knocking, announcing themselves, then nothing. One officer came back down and told me Calvin wasn't answering. They couldn't force entry without a warrant unless they believed someone was in immediate danger. They said they'd file a report and suggested I stay somewhere else for the night. As they were leaving, one younger officer pulled me aside and quietly said, "That door won't keep anyone out now. Don't stay here tonight." I packed a bag with shaking fingers and called an Uber to take me to a motel near the airport, the kind where they don't ask questions and you can pay in cash. The next morning, Monday, I returned with my brother-in-law, Keith, a construction worker who took one look at my door and said we needed to leave immediately and call the landlord. Mr. Reeves finally showed up around noon, took one look at the damage and went pale. Turns out Calvin had been evicted from his last 3 apartments for similar behavior, but somehow that hadn't shown up in the background check. Calvin had disappeared that night. His apartment was empty except for dozens of holes punched in the walls, and my name written in what looked like permanent marker on every surface. The police found recording equipment aimed at the floor and hours of audio files on his computer. They issued a restraining order, but Calvin never showed up to claim his stuff or his security deposit. I moved out 2 weeks later, staying with my sister until I found a new place. Sometimes I still hear phantom footsteps above me, even though I live on the top floor now. The police never found Calvin, and that's what keeps me awake some nights, knowing he's still out there somewhere, probably living above someone else. The house next door used to be quiet until the Andersons moved in last August. I was 8 months pregnant then, waddling around our backyard trying to set up the nursery furniture my husband Craig had assembled wrong twice already. We'd bought this place in the suburbs of Charlotte specifically for the big fenced yard, the good schools, the safe neighborhood where kids could play outside. The Andersons seemed nice enough at first, mid-20s couple, drove a beat-up Subaru with hiking stickers all over the back window. They waved when they moved in, apologized for the noise from the U-Haul, normal neighbor stuff. Then came their first dog, a massive German Shepherd mix they called Thor. No big deal, lots of people have dogs around here, but Thor wasn't like the golden retriever 2 houses down, or the little beagle across the street. Within a week I noticed Thor was always in their backyard, never on walks, just pacing along the fence line like he was plotting something. The Andersons' yard started changing too. Patches of dead grass appeared where Thor did his business, and nobody ever seemed to clean it up. By September, they'd added a second dog, some kind of pit bull mix with 1 blue eye and 1 brown eye that made him look permanently unhinged. They called him Diesel. Now I had 2 huge dogs barking at all hours, charging the fence whenever I tried to water my tomatoes. Craig said I was being paranoid, that pregnancy was making me anxious about everything. But I knew something was wrong with how those dogs acted, the way they'd go silent and still whenever I walked past, tracking me with their eyes like I was prey. Baby Ella arrived in early September, and that's when things got worse. The day we brought her home from the hospital, 3 more dogs had appeared in the Andersons' yard. A boxer with a scarred face, a husky that never stopped howling, and something that looked like a Rottweiler mixed with a small bear. 5 dogs total now, none of them fixed, none of them trained. The smell from their yard started drifting into our windows even when they were closed. I watched from our kitchen as the dogs established a pack hierarchy, fighting over food, mounting each other, tearing apart anything the Andersons left outside. They'd destroyed a patio set within 2 days, leaving twisted metal and shredded cushions scattered across the dirt. The fence between our yards was only 4 feet high. I'd seen Thor clear it once already when he was chasing a squirrel into our garden. The first real incident happened on a Monday morning in late September. I was in the nursery changing Ella when I heard this wet, heavy breathing right outside the window. Diesel had jumped the fence and was standing in our side yard, his mismatched eyes fixed on the window, tongue hanging out and dripping saliva onto our newly planted hydrangeas. He just stood there for maybe 5 minutes, not moving except for his chest heaving with each breath. I grabbed my phone to call Craig, but by the time I looked back, Diesel was gone. When I checked the yard later, there were deep scratches in the dirt beneath Ella's window, like he'd been trying to dig down to the foundation. I found tufts of his gray fur caught on our rose bushes, and a pile of fresh feces right on our doormat, too deliberate to be random, like he was marking our house as his territory. I tried talking to the Andersons that afternoon. The wife, Bridget, answered the door wearing pajama pants with cartoon cats on them, and a tank top covered in what looked like dried dog slobber. The smell that came from inside their house hit me like a physical wall. Ammonia, rot, and something else I couldn't identify but made me want to gag. She listened to me explain about Diesel jumping the fence, nodding along with this vacant smile, her fingers twisted in her unwashed hair. "Oh yeah, he does that sometimes," she said like I was telling her about the weather. "He's just curious about the baby crying. Dogs have really good hearing, you know. He probably thinks she's a puppy or something." The casual way she said it made my chest tighten. Behind her, I could see into their living room. The hardwood floors were scratched to hell, there were holes chewed in the drywall, and one of the dogs had torn apart their couch cushions, leaving foam scattered everywhere like snow. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time Ella made a sound, I'd jolt awake thinking about what Bridget said. The dogs thinking my baby sounded like a puppy. Around 3 a.m., I heard them all start barking at once. Not their usual random noise, but synchronized, purposeful, like they were communicating. I crept to our bedroom window and peered through the blinds. All 5 dogs were lined up along our shared fence, sitting perfectly still in a row, their eyes reflecting the moonlight as they stared directly at our house. The husky, the one with ice blue eyes, had something in his mouth. Took me a second to realize it was one of Ella's toys, a stuffed rabbit we'd lost in the yard the day before. He wasn't chewing it, just holding it gently, like he was saving it. They stayed there for an hour, never barking again, never moving, just watching. I took photos on my phone, but Craig said I was overreacting when I showed him in the morning. The breaking point came on a Saturday. Craig had gone to Home Depot to buy materials for a higher fence, finally believing me after he'd seen Thor clear our fence twice in one day. I was alone with Ella, feeding her in the living room when I heard the back door creak. I always locked it, always, but there it was, slowly swinging open. The boxer appeared first, his scarred face low to the ground, muscles tensed like he was stalking something. Then came Diesel, then the Rottweiler mix. They moved through my kitchen like they owned it, sniffing everything, leaving muddy paw prints on my white tiles. The smell they brought with them was overwhelming. Wet dog mixed with feces and something rancid, like meat left in the sun. They knew exactly where they were going, heading straight for the living room where I sat frozen with Ella against my chest. The boxer's jaw was massive, his teeth yellowed and sharp when he pulled his lips back in what wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't friendly either. I held Ella tighter, her tiny body warm against mine while these three enormous dogs formed a semicircle around my chair. The Rottweiler mix kept making this low rumbling sound in his chest. Not quite a growl, but something primitive that made every instinct scream at me to run. But I couldn't move, couldn't risk triggering their prey drive. Diesel came closest, his blue and brown eyes never leaving Ella's face. He leaned in, his nose almost touching her blanket, nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. His breath was hot and smelled like rotting garbage. Then he did something that still makes me sick to remember. He licked his lips slowly, deliberately, the same way my old dog used to when I was preparing his dinner. The boxer started pacing, his claws clicking on the hardwood, circling us like he was looking for the best angle of approach. For 10 minutes, maybe 15, they just studied us, learning our scents, memorizing our fear. The only sound was their breathing and Ella starting to fuss, probably sensing my terror. Then Ella started crying, that high-pitched newborn wail that sounds almost like an animal in distress. The dog's entire demeanor shifted instantly. Their ears perked up, bodies tensed, and the Rottweiler mix took a step forward, his massive head tilting as he focused on her with an intensity that made my heart pound so hard I thought I might pass out. The boxer stopped pacing and lowered into what looked like a hunting crouch, his scarred face inches from the floor, eyes locked on Ella's moving blanket. Diesel began making these short, sharp huffing sounds, like he was getting excited, working himself up for something. I tried to shush Ella, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. The more she cried, the more agitated they became, and I realized with absolute clarity that they were deciding whether she was food. Not playing, not curious. They were evaluating my 2-month-old daughter as prey. The Rottweiler's mouth opened slightly, strings of drool connecting his upper and lower jaw, and I could see every one of his teeth. That's when the Husky and Thor appeared in the doorway, completing the pack. 5 massive dogs now, blocking every exit, their eyes all trained on my crying baby. The Husky still had her stuffed rabbit in his mouth, but now it was mangled, wet with saliva and torn open, white stuffing spilling out like entrails. Thor, the German Shepherd mix, was the biggest of them all, probably 120 pounds, and he moved with the confidence of an alpha. He walked straight up to us, no hesitation, and put his enormous head right next to Ella. I could feel his breath on my arm, see the pulse in his neck, watch his nose twitch as he processed her scent. Then he made a sound I'll never forget. This deep, guttural rumble that seemed to come from somewhere ancient, something that triggered every evolutionary alarm in my brain. The other dogs responded immediately, forming a tighter circle, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I moved wrong, if I showed fear, if I did anything to trigger them, they would attack. My phone was on the side table just out of reach, and Craig wouldn't be home for at least another hour. I did the only thing I could think of. I started humming. Not a lullaby, but this deep, monotonous sound from my chest, almost matching Thor's rumble. It was something I remembered from a documentary about wolves, how the mother would vocalize to establish dominance over the pack around her pups. Ridiculous, desperate. But Thor's ears twitched, and he pulled back slightly. I kept humming, louder now, adding a slight growl to it, trying to sound bigger than I was. The boxer sat down first, then Diesel, like they were confused by this new sound. I slowly stood up, still making that noise, holding Ella high against my shoulder so I seemed taller. The Rottweiler mix backed up a step. Thor watched me with those intelligent eyes, and I swear he was calculating whether I was worth challenging. For 30 seconds that felt like hours. We stayed locked in this standoff. Then I took one step toward them, still humming that weird growl song, and the Husky dropped the rabbit. Another step, and the boxer whined. On my 3rd step, Thor turned and walked out, and like magic, they all followed him, filing out through my kitchen and back door like they'd never been hunting my baby at all. The second they left, I slammed the door shut, locked it, and shoved a chair under the handle. Then I grabbed my phone and called 911, then Craig, then Animal Control, in that order. The police found the Andersons passed out drunk in their living room, surrounded by dog feces, empty bottles, and what turned out to be illegal drugs. The dogs had been living on cheap kibble mixed with raw ground beef that had spoiled days ago, which explained their increasing aggression. All 5 dogs were removed that day. The Andersons were arrested for animal neglect, child endangerment, and possession. Turns out they'd been collecting dogs from online free-to-good home ads, planning to breed them in some backyard puppy mill scheme, but got overwhelmed and just let them go feral. We moved 2 weeks later, didn't even wait for the house to sell. Craig finally understood why when animal control showed us photos they'd found on Bridget's phone. Dozens of pictures of our house, our yard, and most disturbing of all, zoomed-in photos of Ella through our windows, dated from before the dogs ever jumped our fence. They'd been planning something, though nobody could prove what. These days, living in our new place in Raleigh with a 6-foot privacy fence and security cameras, I still check every door twice before bed, and I can't hear a dog bark without remembering those 10 minutes when 5 untrained dogs evaluated my baby like she was their next meal. About 6 months ago, something happened that completely changed how I think about privacy and personal boundaries. I was 32 at that point, had just relocated to a quiet suburb outside Seattle for a new position as a software developer at a startup downtown. My new neighborhood was everything I'd hoped for after years of cramped apartment living. Mature oak trees lining every street, houses with actual yards and driveways, and this peaceful silence that made you forget downtown was only 20 minutes away. I'd been in my house maybe 2 weeks, still had moving boxes stacked against most walls, when Howard introduced himself. He lived in a faded yellow ranch-style house next door, probably mid-50s, always wearing these old polo shirts tucked into khaki shorts that sat too high on his waist. Our first meeting happened while I was struggling to haul a heavy dresser up my front steps alone. He materialized from nowhere, grabbed one end without asking permission, and helped me carry it inside like we'd planned it together. Howard had this peculiar way of smiling where his mouth would stretch impossibly wide, but his eyes remained completely motionless, like someone had taught him facial expressions from a diagram, but he'd never quite mastered making them look natural. After we positioned that dresser in my bedroom, he lingered on my porch for almost an hour, asking about my job, where I'd lived before, if I had family in Washington. Standard neighbor questions, except he'd lean uncomfortably close when I answered, tilting his head at odd angles like he was recording every syllable. He shared details about our street that nobody would typically notice, which houses had dogs, whose lawn sprinkler activated at what time, when garbage trucks made their rounds. His knowledge was encyclopedic but somehow unsettling. When I finally mentioned having a video conference for work, he stepped back immediately, that unnatural smile never faltering, and promised he'd stop by tomorrow to ensure I was settling in properly. I watched him walk to his house, and he turned around 3 times to wave, each time waiting until I waved back before taking another step. At first, Howard's helpfulness seemed like a blessing. Every morning around 7:30, just as I was leaving for work, he'd materialize on his porch with perfect timing, offering to grab my mail while I was gone, or reminding me about recycling day. He brought over a casserole dish one evening, said his late wife's recipe was too much for one person, and stood in my doorway describing each ingredient while I held that lukewarm dish, nodding politely. He fixed my gate latch without being asked, planted flowers along my fence because he thought it needed color, even started mowing a strip of my lawn when he did his own. Each favor came with that same rigid smile and an expectation that we'd chat afterward. He'd ask specific questions about my workday, knew which coffee shop I stopped at, commented on how late I'd gotten home. I figured he was just lonely and observant. Maybe watched the street from his window out of boredom. Retirement could do that to people, right? Everything shifted one Saturday morning when I decided to grab groceries early, hoping to avoid crowds. I'd barely pulled out of my driveway when I spotted Howard in my rearview mirror, walking briskly down the sidewalk in my direction. Coincidence, I thought, until I saw him again at the store, pushing his cart 2 aisles over, examining a box of cereal with intense concentration. When I moved to produce, he appeared minutes later by the bananas. When I went to check out, he joined the next line over with only 3 items in his cart: a single apple, a box of tissues, and breath mints. He waved enthusiastically when he noticed me, came over to comment on my food choices, actually picked up my package of chicken to check the expiration date. On my drive home, his car stayed exactly 3 vehicles behind mine. That night, while grilling dinner on my back deck, I heard him on his phone in his yard, and chills ran through my entire body when I heard him say my full name, middle name included, and describe what I was wearing, adding that I seemed to prefer blue shirts on weekends. I started paying closer attention after that phone call incident, and what I discovered made me genuinely afraid. Howard knew things he couldn't possibly know through normal observation. When I called in sick to work one day, he knocked on my door within an hour with homemade soup, mentioning he hoped my stomach bug would pass quickly. But I'd never said what was wrong, had only emailed my boss. He commented on a conference call I'd taken in my home office, specifically mentioning my coworker Jason's interesting accent. My windows had been closed, and I'd been wearing headphones. Once he asked if I'd enjoyed the Thai food I'd ordered the previous night, even describing the specific dishes I'd gotten, though the delivery driver had come to my back door at my request. He started leaving notes on my car windshield with observations. Noticed you were low on gas yesterday. There's a cheaper station on Riverside. Or, your left rear tire looks a bit low. I can help you with that. Each note included a smiley face drawn with disturbing precision, perfectly circular with symmetrical features. My breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon when I returned from visiting my brother across town. Howard was standing in my backyard, inside the fence, holding a measuring tape against my kitchen window. When he saw me, he didn't even flinch, just gave me that mechanical smile and explained he wanted to build me a bird feeder that would fit perfectly on my windowsill. Said he'd noticed I enjoyed watching the Cardinals during my morning coffee. I hadn't mentioned the Cardinals to anyone, had only stood at that window a few times. I asked him to leave, tried to keep my voice steady, but he just tilted his head and asked if I was feeling all right, mentioned that I'd been restless lately, that he'd heard me walking around at 2:47 a.m. the night before. He knew the exact time. He suggested maybe I needed more magnesium in my diet, even recommended a specific brand of supplements, said he'd noticed my shopping habits lacked proper nutrients. As he climbed back over my fence instead of using the gate, he mentioned he'd already ordered the wood for that bird feeder, that it would be a surprise for next weekend. That evening, I installed a security camera app on my phone, the kind that uses your old devices as monitors. I set up my tablet facing the front yard and my laptop watching the back, figuring I needed proof that this wasn't just paranoid thinking. Around 11 p.m. while brushing my teeth, I heard a soft scratching sound coming from outside my bathroom window. The frosted glass showed a dark shape moving slowly across it. I checked my phone's camera feed, and there was Howard, standing on a plastic crate, running his fingernail across the window screen in a deliberate pattern. He stayed there for 23 minutes, occasionally pressing his face close to the glass, his breath fogging it up in rhythmic pulses. I recorded everything, watched him finally step down, carefully return the crate to exactly where he'd taken it from beside my garbage bins, then walk back to his house while checking his watch every few steps. He stopped once to pick up a leaf from my driveway and put it in his pocket. I couldn't sleep after that, just sat in my living room with every light on, refreshing those camera feeds obsessively. Around 3 a.m., Howard emerged from his house wearing different clothes, dark sweatpants and a black hoodie I'd never seen him wear. He walked directly to my property line and stood there, perfectly still, facing my house. He didn't move for an entire hour, just stood there like a scarecrow, arms hanging at his sides. Occasionally his head would tilt slightly, like he was listening for something. At exactly 4 a.m., he walked to my mailbox, opened it, looked inside without taking anything, then closed it gently. He repeated this 3 times before walking to my car, circling it slowly while dragging his finger along the surface without quite touching it, maintaining maybe an inch of distance. He paused at my driver's side door, leaned close to the window, and I swear I saw his lips moving like he was having a conversation. He then pulled out a small notebook from his pocket, wrote something while using my car's hood as a surface, tore out the page, and slipped it under my windshield wiper. I waited until sunrise before going outside to retrieve that note, making sure Howard's car was gone first. He left every Monday at 6:15 a.m. sharp for what he'd once told me was his volunteer shift at the library. The paper was damp with morning dew, written in impossibly neat handwriting that looked almost printed. It read, "You forgot to take your vitamin D yesterday. Your kitchen light bulb will burn out in 3 days. You should call your mother. She misses you." My mother had passed away 2 years ago, something I'd never told anyone in the neighborhood. The vitamin D bottle was in my medicine cabinet, and I had indeed forgotten to take it yesterday, though I couldn't fathom how he'd know that. I went inside, locked every deadbolt, and called the police. The officer who came by, a tired-looking woman named Officer Daniels, took notes while I showed her the security footage. She watched Howard standing in my yard at 3 a.m., saw him checking my mailbox, circling my car, but her expression stayed frustratingly neutral. She said unless he actually threatened me or broke into my house, it was hard to prove criminal intent. Checking a mailbox wasn't illegal if nothing was taken. Standing in a yard could be explained away. She suggested I document everything and consider a restraining order, but warned me that neighbor disputes rarely went anywhere without concrete threats or violence. After Officer Daniels left, I decided to work from home for the rest of the week, too unsettled to maintain my normal routine. Howard must have noticed because by noon he was at my door with a container of soup, claiming he'd seen the police car and wanted to make sure everything was all right. I didn't open the door, just talked through it, told him I was fine and busy with work. He stood there for 10 minutes, occasionally saying my name in this sing-song voice, mentioning that isolation wasn't healthy, that he'd noticed I hadn't eaten breakfast, that my garbage disposal had been running for exactly 12 seconds at 9:43 a.m. Then he said something that made my whole body go rigid. He mentioned the teddy bear I kept on my dresser, the one my mom had given me as a kid, said it looked lonely sitting there facing the wall, suggested I turn it toward the bed so it could watch over me properly. My bedroom curtains had been closed for days. There was no way he could see into that room from outside. He must have been inside my house, but when? How? I demanded he leave immediately or I'd call the police again. He laughed, not his usual practiced chuckle, but this hollow sound like wind through an empty pipe, and said the police had already been here and done nothing, hadn't they? That afternoon, I called a locksmith and had every lock in my house changed, installed additional deadbolts, even put security bars on my ground floor windows. The locksmith, a burly guy named Robert, mentioned this was the 3rd house on our street he'd done similar work for in the past year. When I asked about it, he just shook his head and muttered something about that Howard guy before catching himself and changing the subject. I spent the rest of the day searching online for Howard's name, finding almost nothing except a brief mention in an old neighborhood newsletter welcoming him to the area 5 years ago. No social media, no employment history I could find. Nothing. That night I packed a bag and went to stay at a motel 20 miles away, paying cash, not telling anyone where I was going. I needed 1 night of actual sleep, 1 night of peace to figure out my next move. But when I opened my duffel bag in the motel room, there was a folded piece of paper tucked between my clothes that hadn't been there when I packed. Same neat handwriting. Room 237 has bed bugs. Try room 144 instead. Sleep well, neighbor. I drove home immediately, my mind racing with questions about how he'd gotten into my house again, when he'd had time to plant that note. It was past midnight when I pulled into my driveway, and every light in Howard's house was off except for one. a dim glow from what I assumed was his basement window. I sat in my car for a moment, exhausted and scared, when I noticed something that made me sick to my stomach. My house key, the new one I'd just gotten that afternoon, was sitting on my dashboard. I was certain I'd put it in my pocket. I looked toward Howard's house and saw a silhouette in that basement window, just standing there, watching. I grabbed the key, ran to my door, and found it already unlocked. Inside, nothing seemed moved or disturbed, except for one thing. That teddy bear on my dresser was now facing the bed, exactly as Howard had suggested. I packed everything I could fit in my car that night, called my brother to tell him I was coming to stay with him indefinitely, and left. As I drove away, I saw Howard in my rearview mirror, standing in his driveway, holding something up in his hand. It looked like another key, catching the streetlight as he slowly waved goodbye. I remember pulling into that driveway for the very first time, with a strange mix of relief and excitement. The house wasn't anything luxurious, just a modest, single-level place sitting at the edge of a quiet road, where the town gave way to stretches of farmland and patches of forest. After years of cramped apartments and noise from traffic outside our windows, my partner and I thought we'd finally found our version of peace. The wide sky, the sound of crickets at night, and the distant smell of hay all gave us this comforting illusion that life here would be calm, predictable, and safe. At first, the setting delivered exactly what we wanted. We unpacked slowly, spending evenings on the porch, sipping cheap wine and watching the sunset melt into the fields. The quiet was almost overwhelming, but in a good way. It felt like stepping into a forgotten rhythm of life. Even our dog Murphy seemed happier, sniffing the grass and running free in the yard. I convinced myself this move would finally ground us, that we'd built a safe bubble far from the constant noise and stress we'd been used to. But then, we started noticing things. It began with the neighbors across the field dragging rusted car frames into their yard. I told myself it was harmless. Maybe they were hobby mechanics. But soon the sound of engines roaring and metal clanging filled every morning and bled into the evenings. There was no pattern, no schedule. Sometimes at dawn, sometimes late at night, like they worked whenever they felt like it. The sound carried across the open land, echoing in a way that made it impossible to ignore, no matter how many windows we closed. The smell came next. Every weekend without fail, they'd light massive piles of trash behind their property, and the smoke always drifted our way. It wasn't just leaves or wood, plastic, rubber, who knows what else. The fumes seeped into our curtains, clung to our clothes, even settled into the food if we dared open a window. I remember standing in the kitchen one Saturday watching gray smoke curl through the light like it was alive, moving slow and deliberate until the entire room reeked of chemicals. That's when I started to realize this wasn't just going to be a minor inconvenience. This place we thought was peaceful was slowly turning hostile. It didn't stop with smoke and noise. Behind their property line stretched a patch of woods, and some nights we'd hear sudden bursts of gunfire. At first I thought it was just hunters, but it wasn't hunting season. The shots came at strange hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, sharp cracks that rattled the windows. Murphy would bark and pace around, ears pinned back, and I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each echo, wondering what kind of neighbors thought it was normal to fire rifles in the dark with houses nearby. The longer we stayed, the more it felt like the neighborhood belonged to them and we were just intruders. Every time I stepped outside, they'd stop whatever they were doing and watch. Not a casual glance, but a fixed, lingering stare that followed me until I went back inside. It got to the point where I avoided the yard altogether, even though the whole reason we moved there was to finally have open space. My partner tried to brush it off. They're just eccentric, maybe they don't realize how much it bothers us. But I could see the unease in their face too, especially after the third or fourth fire burned late into the night, throwing orange light over the trees like a warning. One evening, I decided to confront them. I walked across the lot while they were tinkering with a rusted truck frame. The man, tall with a gray beard that looked more like steel wool, leaned on a wrench while the woman, short and wiry, smoked a cigarette that smelled harsher than anything I'd ever inhaled. I tried to keep my tone calm, asking if they could maybe keep the fires smaller, since the smoke always drifted inside our home. They just stared. The man spat on the ground. The woman let out a low laugh, and without saying a single word, they turned back to their work. The rejection felt deliberate, like they wanted me to understand we had no say here. After that, things escalated in subtle but unnerving ways. Our mailbox would get left open, rain soaking through the letters. Deep ruts appeared in the dirt path leading up to our driveway, as if someone had spun their tires on purpose. Once, when I came home late, I noticed a row of glass bottles lined neatly along the edge of our fence, catching the moonlight. By the next morning, they were gone. It was small stuff, never enough to prove anything, never enough to call the police, but each incident chipped away at whatever sense of safety we thought this place would give us. The breaking point came on a Sunday evening. We were inside eating dinner when the familiar haze of smoke began to seep through the kitchen window. I stepped outside to check, and this time the fire wasn't just trash. It looked like an entire heap of furniture, plastic chairs, and even tires. The flames climbed so high they lit up the treetops, and sparks drifted dangerously close to our yard. My partner grabbed Murphy and stayed by the door while I dialed the fire department, my voice shaking as I tried to explain. By the time the truck arrived, the neighbors had already doused the flames with a garden hose, standing there smugly as if nothing was wrong. After that call, the atmosphere between us and them hardened. They didn't speak to us, but their glares said enough. One night I heard the rumble of an engine outside, and when I peeked through the blinds, their truck idled at the edge of our driveway for a solid minute before pulling away. No words, no gestures, just the hum of the engine in the dark. It was intimidation, plain and simple. I realized then that this wasn't going to change, no matter how many calls I made or conversations I tried to have. We lasted 3 more months before packing up and leaving. Every night felt heavier than the last. Every sound outside a reminder that we weren't wanted there. The house itself had been perfect for us, but the land surrounding it felt poisoned by hostility. We sold it for less than we paid, just to get out quickly. Driving away for the last time, I didn't feel relief, just a strange emptiness, like I was abandoning the version of peace I thought we'd finally found. Even now, when I catch the smell of burning plastic or hear a car engine rev in the distance, my mind shoots back to that place. It's been years, but I still wonder if those neighbors drove out anyone who dared move in after us. That house taught me something I never forgot. Peace isn't about where you live, it's about who surrounds you. And sometimes the worst nightmares aren't inside the house. They're right next door, watching, waiting, making sure you never forget them. That day sticks in my mind because it started with something so ordinary. I'd just gotten home from a long shift, carrying groceries up the narrow steps to my apartment. My new neighbor, a guy named Marcus, leaned against his truck and waved me over. He looked approachable enough. Broad smile, sunburn on his nose, holding a couple of beers already sweating in his hand. He offered me one before I'd even set my bags down. Felt like the beginning of the kind of easy neighborly relationship you don't see much anymore. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. We'd chat outside in the evenings, him perched on the hood of his truck, me leaning against the railing with a cold drink. He told me he'd moved from a smaller town, said he was glad to finally have normal neighbors after dealing with idiots at his last place. I didn't think much of it. Everyone complains about neighbors at some point. I figured he just wanted a fresh start, and honestly, I was glad to have someone friendly next door. The first sign things weren't as smooth as I thought came after a minor disagreement. He'd asked if I could help him move a heavy piece of furniture late at night, and I told him I had work early the next morning. He gave me this blank stare, didn't argue, just walked back inside without another word. The next day, his attitude toward me felt different. He barely acknowledged me, just a nod that seemed forced. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I'd caught him in a bad mood. Then little things started piling up. His truck was suddenly parked so close to my car that I had to squeeze in through the passenger side just to get behind the wheel. Music blasted from his place at strange hours. Not every night, but enough to keep me on edge, like he wanted me to never feel completely comfortable at home. First, I wondered if I was overthinking it, but the pattern kept repeating, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. One night I came home around midnight and caught him standing right next to my car, staring at it like he was inspecting every inch. When he saw me, he didn't move right away. He just smirked and muttered something about people around here not respecting property. I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and walked back inside. The next morning, I noticed fresh scratches along the side of my car door. They weren't deep, but enough to be obvious. I couldn't prove it was him, yet it felt deliberate. Things escalated quickly after that. He started accusing me of petty things, leaving trash by his steps, letting packages sit too long in the hallway, even saying I borrowed tools from him and never returned them. None of it was true. Every time he confronted me, his voice carried this sharp edge, like he was daring me to argue. I tried to keep calm, telling him he must be mistaken, but he'd just shake his head like I was lying straight to his face. The shift from friendly neighbor to hostile stranger was so sudden it felt surreal. One afternoon, I pulled into the lot and found his truck parked practically against my bumper. I couldn't even back out without knocking into it. I knocked on his door to ask him to move it, and he opened it shirtless, blasting music so loud the walls vibrated. He leaned against the frame like he had all the time in the world, grinning at me while I struggled to raise my voice over the noise. "Guess you'll have to figure it out," he said before closing the door in my face. I ended up waiting almost an hour before he finally moved his truck. The worst moments were the confrontations outside. Twice he followed me as I walked toward my building, hurling accusations about things I hadn't done, his tone louder each time. The last time, he got close enough that I could smell beer on his breath, and for a second, I thought he might actually swing at me. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears, but I kept walking, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to want. Still, the sense that he was pushing toward something dangerous never left me. After weeks of this tension, I started changing my routine just to avoid him. I'd leave earlier for work, come home later, sometimes circle the block until I was sure he wasn't outside. But one night, when I parked, he was already waiting. He leaned against his truck, arms crossed, the headlights casting his shadow long across the pavement. He said I'd been messing with his life, and that he knew what I was up to. His words didn't even make sense, but the way he said them, low and deliberate, made me feel like I was trapped in some feud I never agreed to. That was the moment I realized it wasn't going to stop on its own. The next morning, I spoke with the building manager, explaining everything. To my surprise, they admitted they'd had other complaints about him. Noise, intimidation, even threats. They told me to keep documenting incidents and promised to look into it. It wasn't exactly comforting, but it gave me a sliver of relief knowing I wasn't imagining how bad he'd gotten. A few days later, he was gone. His truck disappeared overnight, the blinds in his windows drawn tight. The manager said he'd broken his lease early. No explanation. I half expected him to come back for one last round, but he never did. Just like that, the constant pressure lifted. The silence in the parking lot, once unsettling, felt like the best sound in the world. I could finally breathe again. Even now, I don't fully understand what triggered his shift from friendly to hostile. Part of me wonders if he was looking for a fight all along, waiting for an excuse. Another part thinks he carried baggage from wherever he lived before, and I just became the target. Either way, I'll never forget how quickly someone can change, and how dangerous it feels when your own home stops being a place of peace. My name is Aaron, and during that time I was living alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the edge of a mid-sized town. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was mine, and after a rough breakup, I wanted the space to start over. My routine was simple: work at a dental office during the day, grab groceries on my way home, and spend most evenings quietly reading or watching TV. The building had a shared parking lot tucked behind it, with a single flickering light pole that only half lit the rows of cars. That lot, as ordinary as it seemed at first, became the reason I barely slept for months. It started subtly, just noise that carried through my thin walls after dark. I'd hear bursts of laughter, the crack of beer cans opening, and the heavy bass of someone's music rattling from a car with its doors open. At first, I brushed it off as neighbors blowing off steam. Everyone has the right to unwind, and it wasn't my place to complain. But after a week or so, I noticed a pattern. It wasn't different groups, it was always the same cluster of men, and they always seemed to gather right near my car. I couldn't help checking through my blinds whenever their voices rose. 5, maybe 6 of them leaning against hoods, passing bottles, tossing cigarette butts onto the pavement. They weren't particularly young, late 20s to mid-30s, rough around the edges with worn hoodies, scuffed boots, and the kind of casual arrogance that comes from knowing no one's going to stop you. The detail that bothered me most was how often their attention landed on my silver Corolla. It wasn't anything special, but more than once I caught them leaning on it like it was theirs, boots scraping the paint, one of them even spitting on the ground inches from the tires. The first time they noticed me watching, it was like a switch flipped. I'd only pulled the blinds back an inch, but one of them, tall, shaved head, a tattoo curling down his neck, tilted his chin up and smirked directly at my window. He said something I couldn't make out, but it made the others laugh in unison, their voices carrying too clearly through the still night. After that, the mockery became part of their routine. Every time I peeked out, they'd exaggerate gestures, point at my window, or shout things just loud enough for me to catch my name or the word princess. It was no longer just noise, it was aimed, and it was aimed at me. I started parking in different spots, hoping they wouldn't notice, but no matter where I left my car, they gravitated toward it. Sometimes they leaned their weight against the doors, leaving faint smudges on the windows, or tapped beer bottles on the trunk like it was their personal table. The thought of confronting them crossed my mind more than once, but I knew it wouldn't go anywhere. I was one woman against a group of men who thrived on being intimidating. Instead, I pretended I didn't notice, though inside it ate at me every night. The nights got louder and the jokes got sharper. One evening, while I was brushing my teeth, I heard my own last name shouted across the lot, like it was the punchline of some cruel joke. They shouldn't have known it, and the fact they did made me grip the sink so tight my knuckles went white. My mail had my name on it, sure, but it was in a locked box. That meant they'd either seen me bringing something inside or gone out of their way to find it. Either possibility was enough to make my chest tighten. From then on, I lived in a state of constant alert. I kept the TV on low at night, just so I could track when their laughter drifted closer. My blinds stayed closed, though sometimes I pressed my ear against the cool glass, straining to hear what they were saying. The sound of their boots crunching gravel, bottles clinking, and someone kicking at a bumper became the background noise of my evenings. I hated how small it made me feel, pacing around my own apartment while strangers claimed the space outside like it belonged to them. One night, I heard a different sound, a deliberate slow drag across my car's hood. Metal on metal, sharp and high. My heart thudded as I realized they were scraping something against the paint. I didn't dare look, but the next morning the proof was there. A jagged line running across the front, deep enough that no amount of washing would hide it. I stood in the lot with my keys in hand, staring at the scar on my car, while one of the men lounged on a nearby bumper, watching me with a lazy, knowing expression. He didn't say a word, and that silence was worse than anything he could have shouted. I started dreading the walk from my apartment door to the car. Even in daylight, I felt their eyes on me. One of them would always nudge another when I passed, muttering under his breath with a grin that made my pulse race. I called the landlord, but his response was a flat, "Not much I can do, it's a shared lot." That sentence alone left me feeling abandoned. like I had no backup in a place that was supposed to be my home. I considered breaking the lease, but moving costs weren't an option for me then. The turning point came late on a Friday night. Their voices were louder than usual, echoing up the stairwell into my living room. Then came 3 sharp bangs, not on a car, but on my own front door. My breath caught in my throat as the knocks repeated. Slower this time, deliberate. The laughter outside roared. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood in the dark with my back pressed against the wall, counting the seconds until the noise drifted away again. When I finally dared to peek through the peephole, no one was there, just the dim glow from the parking lot. That night I made my decision. The next morning I called my brother, explained everything, and he drove over with 2 friends. We spent the entire day hauling boxes into a rented truck. I didn't even finish cleaning out the place. I just wanted out. The men were out there while we packed, lounging against a pickup, watching with lazy smirks. They didn't interfere, but their presence made my skin crawl. My brother caught one of their stares and muttered, "Don't worry, they won't try anything with us here." I clung to that reassurance even though I wasn't convinced. I moved into a smaller unit across town, closer to my job and in a complex with security cameras and brighter lights. It's been years, and I still avoid driving past that old street. The memory sticks with me though. Not just the harassment, but how quickly a simple living situation can turn into something unsafe. People always say, "Trust your gut," and I wish I had listened sooner. The scratches on my old car eventually faded under new paint, but the sense of being cornered in my own space hasn't left me. To this day, I still catch myself checking the blinds twice before I sleep.